This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Very good morning to you. It's 3 minutes after 10, and you could be forgiven for suffering from a tiny little frisson of déjà vu this morning, because I'm keen to return to a question that we talked about yesterday. The reality of what we were discussing has become crystal clear, and, well, the consequences of it will be measured pretty shortly. The front of the Times was interesting today when it said, "We'll be back." Prisoners acknowledging, prisoners released a little earlier than they would otherwise have been released, acknowledging we'll be back, not least because they have nowhere to go. Repeat burglar, for example, said he would be back in jail soon because he did not have any housing. "I will end up back here. I will start drinking, going back to what I used to do because of a lack of knowing where I'm staying." A shoplifter released from HMP Brixton, who's already been jailed more than 50 times, which suggests that these policies don't work very well, said, "I'll be back," channeling Arnold Schwarzenegger there. Where to start, really, on this? Except with a reminder that any answer to the question of what could they have done differently, because there's a sense, isn't there, whatever your politics, there's a sense that surely this wasn't the only option available. Surely they could have done something. We wondered yesterday how much coverage would manage, either through ignorance or corruption, would manage to completely ignore that letter sent to Rishi Sunak 1 week before the general election by Sir Mark Rowley and 2 other chief constables, so 3 of the most senior police officers in the entire country. That letter urging Rishi Sunak a week before the election to implement precisely the policy that Keir Starmer implemented within days of getting into Downing Street, the beginning of the fruition of which we saw yesterday with 1,750 prisoners being released earlier than they otherwise would have been. I don't really understand, and I'm a student of bent far right-wing media. I don't really understand how you can cover this story without acknowledging that every 20 minutes. You can say they inherited a problem, but you have to acknowledge that it was a problem not only created by the Tories, but deliberately set up to leave Keir Starmer in the position that he finds himself in now. Rishi Sunak could have implemented this months ago. Rishi Sunak was urged by the most senior police officers in the country to do this, and he ignored them. He completely ignored them. I'm not even sure he replied to the letter from the Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police. So I think what happened yesterday was I asked you 2 questions and you only really answered 1, because I kind of possibly created an atmosphere in which you would have felt that I was calling you an idiot if you tried to answer the second question. We're in a bit of a pickle, because maybe there aren't any answers to the question of what they could have done differently. You can tell that they are at a bit of a loose end when the kind of people who have never mentioned the fact that prisoners have been released early every year for the last 50, or every year for the last 20, or every year for the last 10. It's just a number that has gone up, and the earliness that has been temporarily increased. Recidivism, people returning to prison after offending, is one of the most shameful aspects of our justice system. The levels of recidivism, the levels of returning to jail, due largely, as many callers pointed out yesterday, to issues like literacy and housing, much more than criminality or some sort of innate badness. You're much more likely to return to jail if you can't look after yourself outside jail. And if you can't read or write very well, then you are less likely to be able to look after yourself outside jail. Addiction, literacy, and housing issues, I imagine, would be the 3 most obvious answers to the prison crisis, but they're all long-term, unless, of course, you're honest Bob Jenrick, in which case the answer is to send people to prison for longer. Honest Bob Jenrick's solution to the continuing prisons crisis is to lock up prolific offenders for longer. That's a great idea. And also to build more prisons, and I saw one of his colleagues, Neil O'Brien, retweeting the call for him to build more prisons, and someone dug out a photograph of Neil O'Brien standing next to a big poster saying, "Don't build a mega prison in my constituency." So quite how the logic of that situation shakes down. Is he still in the Parliament? I don't even know. It's so hard to keep track of these things. So I very, very rarely bother these days because post-Musk, the place has become so absurd, really, and you just don't know what's real and what's not. But I do sometimes find it interesting to find out what the furiously hard of thinking have to say. And in answer to my question yesterday, and some of the replies on the LBC clips of what could have been done differently, and you remember I used the analogy of a pint pot. You have a pint pot that's full of water, and then you have a shot glass that's also full of water. The water in the shot glass needs to be put into the pint pot. So what are you going to do? So if you're furiously hard of thinking, you could answer, build another pint pot. Like, obviously, it would involve a time machine in order to have enough prison places to accommodate people who are needing imprisonment today. But yeah, okay, time machines notwithstanding, you could go back in time 2 years. Turning already existing property into prisons, listen, that's not furiously hard of thinking. That's just a little bit naive. You know, you can't turn the old Debenham store on Oxford Street into a prison for a whole variety of reasons. Similarly, you know, an old abandoned prison that isn't a prison anymore, that would be easier to repurpose, but there'll be a reason why it's not a prison anymore. And that will have something to do with conditions. Conditions in prisons that are still open are already pretty hideous. You know, cells designed for 2 people containing 4 or 5 or 3 or 4. Forgive me if I'm not fully au fait with the figures, but the principle is the point. Cells designed for X and now contain X plus 1 or X plus 2. So, and then, of course, I don't know, Anton, is this Idiot's Corner? I've seen this quite a bit as well. Let's deport all the foreign ones. Great. And then all the British people in jails overseas come back here. And that solves what precisely, or that achieves what precisely? Apart, of course, from the fact that deporting people for shoplifting or burglary would involve all manner of breaches of human rights and would begin to undermine your rights before the law as well. Because if you can deport a foreigner for shoplifting, then why on earth would you be resistant to the idea of punishing a British shoplifter in a cruel and unusual way? So I don't think you go into Idiot's Corner with that suggestion, Anton, and I've seen it around the place quite a lot. It's not law. So how do we do it? What is the solution? What else could they have done differently? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And that's what I mean by being in a bit of a pickle. I don't think there are any answers to this question. So we may need another one. But let's have a look. 0345. I knew I shouldn't put you in Idiot's Corner, Anton. He's just come back with a message. Just an idea. And it is just an idea. And that's fine. It's just not a very good idea. It's not a very effective idea. And it's certainly not something that could be implemented yesterday. That's the point. I mean, it's both a figure of speech and a matter of fact. It's a policy that needs to have been implementable yesterday. What else could they have done? A pint pot full of prisoners, a shot glass full of prisoners. The prisoners in the shot glass need to be put in the pint pot. What are you going to do with the pint pot to create the space needed for the prisoners in the shot glass? I don't want to labour the point, but sometimes I think we do stumble together upon analogies or imagery that is absolutely copper-bottomed. It's irrefutably accurate, that analogy. And that's why, even after my years of experience with the furiously hard of thinking, it's incredible to watch people who apparently lack the capacity to understand something as simple as that. Something as simple as a full glass, a full big glass and a full little glass. If you need to get the stuff in the full little glass into the big glass, what do you do with the stuff in the big glass? But, you know, people paying Elon Musk $8 a month for a blue tick on Twitter or on X or whatever it's called this week are absolutely convinced that the answer is to build more glasses yesterday. That's the point. At risk of coming over all Paul McCartney, yesterday is the point here. What could you have done yesterday to solve this crisis? So I really want to take calls on that, but I'm not entirely sure that I will, because I can't currently see what alternative there was. And if there was a viable alternative, I think the Labour Party would have taken it. I'll tell you something they've done that's really stupid, is cutting court days. We may, if we have time, because I do want to spend a little bit of time looking at events in America last night, where apparently they eat cats. I do want to explain a little bit about cuts in court days. Secret Barrister's at social media account very strong on this, because that is a Labour decision and that is stupid. That is really, really bad. But I don't know that there are any or many answers to the question of what else could they have done. And if you can't answer that, then you shouldn't really be falling for the nonsense being served up to you by the kind of people who completely ignore the fact that Rishi Sunak was begged effectively a week before the general election to implement precisely the policy that Keir Starmer is now implementing. So I'm going to push this, because usually when I do this, I'm doing it in a slightly, what would the word be? In a slightly, dare I say, manipulative way. Well, if I say, I bet I don't get any calls on this, I'm really teasing you in a way, because I know I probably will. But on this one, I don't think there's an answer to and that's the point. If there's no actual answer to the question of what they could have done differently, then front page of the Daily Mail today, after just 68 days, Starmageddon, who voted for all this, is not only disingenuous, but also deeply dangerous, because it renders the inevitable controversial. If the Daily Mail can't tell us what should have been done differently, if right-wing people can't tell us what should have been done differently, then they should, frankly, in the words of Gavin Williamson, God, you remember him? They should shut up and go away. If they can't actually tell you, and I don't think anyone can, whether you or me, or the kind of half-wits writing headlines or writing articles under the headline, who voted for all this? And that's your starter at 10, 0345 606 0973. Politico's playbook this morning reports that former Justice Secretary Alex Chalk also warned Rishi Sunak about the need for a prisoner release scheme, about the need for this prisoner release scheme as long ago as June the 20th. The ITV journalist Anushka Asthana has written a new book in which she quotes Chalk as reportedly saying that if they didn't have one, if they didn't do what Keir Starmer has done this week, then the government should, and I quote, get down on their knees and pray. That's a former Tory Justice Minister. So where else are you getting the facts laid out in this way? Who else is telling you the truth in this fashion? And who is encouraging you to sign up to the idea that this is some sort of scandal of Labour's making? A quick nod. Oh, yes, I know they inherited the situation, but there is no but. Rishi Sunak ignored pleas from senior police officers and senior members of his own government with a justice brief to do what is being done now. If you can't answer the question of what should have been done differently, then frankly you should be quiet. Which leads me to the question that I think you will be able to answer. But that is a bona fide wish for you to ring in and tell me how this could have been handled differently. Okay? I just don't think there are any answers to that question. I don't know how many calls. Let me just consult with the producer. Eleanor, how many calls can we take from people saying there are no answers to that question before things get a bit dull? 2? I suppose it depends on how much riz the callers have, doesn't it? Depends on how much riz the callers have. But 1 or 2 people are welcome to ring in and tell me there are no alternatives, but we might set the bar quite high on qualifications and experience. So, Bob the Builder, maybe not. Pete the prison officer or Pete the prison governor, maybe we'll hear from you about what could, or the coppers that listen to the programme, maybe we'll hear from you about what could have been done differently. Which leads us to the question that I think you might be able to answer, and that is this, and this depends upon insight as much as experience. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Are we going to see anything that is measurably worse than what we always see in terms of released prisoners returning to prison? I'll tell you something for nothing. The kind of vampires trying to muster up fury with headlines who voted for all this, they will pretend that if a prisoner released under this scheme is returned to, they'll pretend it's the first time it's ever happened in history. The headlines you'll see, if someone released yesterday is back in jail by the end of the month, the headlines you'll see will create the impression that this is the very, very, very first time that this has ever happened, and it's all Keir Starmer's fault, that this fella who's got no place to live after 14 years of Tory rule went back to burgling in order to put a few quid in his pocket and get back on the bottle. That you can absolutely guarantee that is what they'll do. But how will we know whether or not this has created as many problems or even more problems than it's solved? What do you think is going to happen? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need, okay? 0345 6060 973. Question I don't think you can answer. What else could they have done? Question that I really think you can answer. What could they have done differently? 0345 6060 973. It's 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 10, and something else occurs to me, actually. Maybe we should be a little bit more generous and take calls from people who think they've got answers to the question, and I can point out why they haven't. That might be fun. That might be entertaining. But there is, of course, news from over the other side of the Atlantic that we should have a little listen to. Do you know, ABC, who hosted the debate, very strict on how much I can play you from last night's event. So I've got 6 clips, which is my absolute limit. And I thought I would pepper the programme with the sort of key moments from Donald Trump's debate with Kamala Harris yesterday. Or everybody honest seems to think that Kamala Harris scored a resounding victory. The mystery to me remains why Donald Trump's obvious cognitive decline doesn't draw anything like as much attention as Joe Biden's. But let's have a little look or a little listen to some of the events. We'll start with an exchange about the ongoing carnage in Gaza.
If she's president, I believe that Israel will not exist within 2 years from now. And I've been pretty good at predictions, and I hope I'm wrong about that one. She hates Israel. At the same time, in her own way, she hates the Arab population because the whole place is going to get blown up.
What we know is that this war must end. It must end immediately, and the way it will end is we need a ceasefire deal and we need the hostages out.
It is 22 minutes after 10. It gets better, especially if you remember that time when The Sun invented a story about immigrants in this country eating swans. That's had a bit of a return. Not a swan song, sadly, because it's actually a resurrection or a revivification. Loosely, in pencil, we might write, why all answers to the question I've asked today are wrong. Let's find out why. Alex is in Kentish Town. Alex, what could the government have done differently?
Good morning, James. Sorry, I'm very, very nervous at the moment. But anyway,
it's only me.
My point is, if a prisoner is released, for argument's sake, 7 months sooner than he could have been released, yeah. So those 7 months that he would have served in prison, why can't the government place them on a farm where they can work for those 7 months?
Yeah.
And with accommodation on the farm, and then after that 7 month period, which they were due to be released, then it's their choice to go wherever they want to go.
Yeah, 2 problems with that.
Go on.
The farm is not a prison, so who's going to make sure? Who's going to make sure they stay there?
Well, it's up to them. If they stay there, then they would have served all their sentence. If they leave, then they go straight back in jail, as they would do in the open world.
And who is going to keep an eye on things? We're going to have to hire a whole sort of tranche of new farm guards, a bit like in Cool Hand Luke.
Who would keep an eye on them now when they're released out to the general public?
Well, the probation service, which is hugely underfunded and arguably not fit for purpose. But anyway, that's just problem number 1.
Yeah.
Problem number 2 is this has to be something that can be implemented yesterday.
Okay. You got me.
That's what I do. Hey, ring me again, Alex. Promise?
I promise I'll ring you again.
We'll do it again. 10:24 is the time. Charlie's in Shefford in Bedfordshire. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello.
There needs to be joined up thinking where the police, the probation service and the Ministry of Justice all communicate, because you have prisoners who are released from prison.
Why isn't there? Why isn't there joined up thinking already?
There isn't at the minute, because the court can impose that a shoplifter be excluded from the city centre of the town that they reside. On the day that they are released, they're told that they must go and see their probation officer, whose office may be smack in the middle of their exclusion zone.
Or they may the bus may be cancelled, which means they miss an appointment, which means they can be sent straight back to jail again.
The amount of times I was a police officer, now I'm a prison officer, and the amount of people we see coming back the next day because they have been recalled because they've been picked up on their way to the probation office, having to walk through an excluded zone, or the fact that they missed their appointment because they were at the housing office trying to get accommodation because that was their first major need.
In an area where they're not allowed to be. I've not heard that before, but goodness me, it's a problem, isn't it?
It's not. There's no joined up thinking where the court will impose conditions, but then the probation do not speak up and say, but you've told him he cannot come and see us because we're based here. So they're setting them up to fail before they've even left prison.
And this is almost certainly going to apply to some of the 1,650 people let out of jail early yesterday. But you as a prison officer... Go on.
I know of one prisoner who got released yesterday who's back in already.
Are you sure? Because that's a story.
I only heard it from a colleague from another prison.
All right.
But he's back in already.
I might get Eleanor to take some details of that, just so that one of our news hounds can start digging into it. But it is absolutely bound to happen. The point is, the difference on my side of the fence, as a representative of the media, the difference in the journalism will be you as a police officer turned prison officer telling us that this happens all the time. Right-wing media will seize upon that story and pretend that it's the first time it's ever happened in the history of the world, and it's a direct consequence of kids. Yeah, I know they know, but they've been lying to the readers and the listeners for years, mate.
Of course they're going to lie.
That's the way it goes.
They want it to fit their narrative.
Yes, you know that, and I know that. Here's the problem with your proposal, and it's a sensible proposal, and you're a thoughtful man, speaking from a position of evidence and experience, which, of course, will never catch on, but it has to be something they could have implemented yesterday.
It could be, because all they need to do is it could easily be done, because
maybe it's doable, but not yesterday.
It could be done right now.
How long would it take?
Probation office, it could take minutes, because if an edict was sent out, if there's a probation officer in the court when the person is being sentenced and the judge is given these conditions,
but we haven't got the bodies for that. You know we haven't.
In every single court, there's a probation officer. There's one not for each court.
Yeah, but it doesn't follow each criminal home or follow each criminal's case moving forward. You need your own probation officer to be in court with you to know everything that's going on, and that's never going to happen.
No, that is true. But then the conditions don't need to be set at point of sentence. They could be set during the sentence, where time can be taken to actually consider.
And now we've got something we can lay. Now we've got something we can lay at Labour's door, which is a reduction in the number of sentencing days, which, as far as I can tell, is only going to make absolutely everything worse. But to be clear, you're describing epic systemic decline presided over by the Tory party for the last 14 years.
But then you've got, you look at it from the other side. You've got people that are in prison who are waiting, who are there because they've had mental health crisis, who are not really criminals, but they have been sent there because they've caused a breach of the peace, they've been arrested, when all they need is actual mental health help. But there is not the capacity.
Well, that is the problem with your plan overall, is that there is not the capacity for, in my view, any of the things you describe. But that in no way compromises their desirability. We're examining the inevitability of what the Labour government did yesterday, and it remains inevitable unless you can come up with something that could have been implemented yesterday. And of course, what you're addressing is a broader systemic problem. What you're introducing would not have solved the problem of there being a full pint pot and a full shot glass, and needing to get some of the stuff in the shot glass into the pint pot. It wouldn't have solved that problem. The point is, as we will continue to demonstrate on the programme, nobody can solve that problem. So you can go on social media, of course, and talk about building more prisons or building more pint pots, but you in many ways, you'd be better off just waving a flag saying, I don't really like thinking about things and I'm not very bright. There is no answer, whether you're writing for the Daily Mail, whether you're fulminating on the wireless, whether you're peppering social media with your pungent but completely ill-thought-out opinions. Unless you can tell me something that you can do to reduce the number of people in prison in order to accommodate the number of people that are being sent to prison, then we're in a rabbit hole of madness. Another rabbit hole, even with a Labour government, of right-wing media madness, where they are pretending that black is white, up is down, and the next unicorn on Platform 4 will be here in 24 minutes. You're listening to 10:30. We need to spend a little bit more time, of course, also looking at what has happened in America. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I say you're listening to 10:30 a minute ago. Well, that's not true, is it? You're listening to James O'Brien. It is half. So that's What would the word be? That's like autopilot. It's autopilot. No, it's not sloppy, Keith. It's unprofessional, pathetic, the signs of early onset dementia. That is autopilot. So if I go into autopilot with various phrases, I suppose on occasion it's inevitable that they'll be reassembled in the wrong order. So what would be part of autopilot for our time? The number 0345 6060 973. I could probably. You're listening to 0345. I could easily say that, couldn't I? You're listening to 0345 6060 973. It's half past James. I could easily do these sort of things. I mean, frankly, for all your criticism that is, I'm not going to lie, hurtful, and also surprisingly voluminous, for all your criticism, I don't think I could help it. I think that's a perfectly reasonable slip-up. 10:32 is the time. What can we do about what could the government have done differently? Brackets, the answer is almost certainly nothing, but that won't stop the right-wing media trying to manufacture a traditional brouhaha. Joe's in Nettleton. Joe, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
Thanks for having me on.
You're very
I'm the first
welcome.
time caller, quite nervous.
That is only
Enjoying your
me.
book, though.
Oh, that's nice. There we go. We're bound to get on.
Well, I think you're going to take me down on this.
Go on.
But I haven't heard much of the conversation of halfway houses. And I know you spoke to a caller before about the farm. That perhaps the people who are being released could be put into halfway houses for 6 months or so. There's an officer there and some staff, and they can come and go, check in and out, here's your key, and sort of gradually get back to society like that, which seems kind of utopian, doesn't it? But where are you going to get the staff, where are you going to get the houses? I suppose they can get the land because the government took enough land like HS2 and stuff. I mean, they can buy houses.
Listen, I think, are you younger than me, Joe? You sound younger than me.
Oh, yeah, I'm 28.
All right, you nearly said much then, didn't you?
Yeah.
That's all right. So I think in my grizzled old memory banks, I think things like this used to exist and possibly still do. Community-based offender programs that provide support to offenders. There's also that Tommy Lee Jones film, isn't there, where I think there was some sort of relationship between his character and the manager of a halfway house. But what's clear, and this is why you were worried that I was going to shoot you down, what's clear is that they couldn't have done that yesterday. This might be a way of moving forward. And in fact, the proposal to put some of these people up in budget hotels, because the alternative would be, as one the burglar told the Times today, an almost immediate return to jail. That's like a sort of an unsatisfactory version of what you're describing that once again channels public money into the pockets of the private sector, where if it was public sector funded and it was part of the prison system, part of the justice system, it would be fit for purpose, just not ready in time for yesterday.
Thanks. You might love or hate this, but they were talking about there being prison spaces to rent in like Eastern Europe. And that was like clearly on the table. Could they have sent some people there for 6 months while they set up these new halfway houses?
Prisoners, I think prisoners have a right to visitation, and the
that makes sense.
I think the circumstances of visitation have to be vaguely plausible. One hears terrible stories about people being moved to prisons at the other end of the country from their family, and their family simply can't afford to visit, which I presume would become even more of a problem were they to be in Estonia. As opposed to so again, you know.
So why was that on the table in the first place? Like that?
I don't know, but because honestly, I think I can answer that question because they are genuinely doing what we're doing. They are casting around desperately for solutions to the mess that they've inherited.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, thank you. I look forward to your second call to the programme. Unfortunately, the people who created the mess, everybody involved in the last 14 years of Tory government, are now, in fact, a leadership contender, honest Bob Jenrick, said yesterday, the solution is simple, build more prisons and lock up prolific offenders for longer. That's an intervention of almost unbelievable disingenuousness from a politician of almost unbelievable dishonesty. Honest Bob Jenrick, after 14 years in government, including it was housing, health, immigration, including various ministerial positions, claiming that the solution to the problem his various governments of which he was part, going back to 2018, the solution to the problems they created was simple all along. That's why I've told you on a few occasions that if the Tory party is to recover anything like its traditional status and reputation, it's not going to happen under the next leader or possibly the next two, because they're doubling down on the nonsense that they have inflicted on the country for the last 14 years. And the answer to the question of how on earth they think they're going to get away with it is on the front page of the Daily Mail today. Who voted for all this? It's all Keir Starmer's fault. How long has he been in power? How long before the general election did the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police urge Rishi Sunak to do exactly what is being done now? And why do some people, is it footballification that makes it so hard for some people to just acknowledge this is an almighty skip fire, but it's hard to see how Keir Starmer could have handled it any differently? It is just footballification, isn't it? How dare you say that? If it was the other lot. Well, you tell me what they could have done differently then, and I'll shake you by the hand and give you a biscuit. Paul's in Gosport. Paul, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James. Great show, by the way.
Well, it's all right if you like that sort of thing, but thank you.
Yeah, it's okay. I was ringing up reference the early release of prisoners. Where I live, in Gosport, there's actually a old MOD site that has just recently been decommissioned, but it still has MOD police on the gates.
Yes.
And one good thing about this base is it's actually on a peninsula surrounded by water.
I like it.
And its old name is actually called Fort Blockhouse.
Blockhouse.
Blockhouse,
Love
as
it.
in prison.
Yes.
So it was originally an artillery, horse artillery base, which basically got condemned, and then they said, let's use it for submariners, which was a bit ironic, but there you go. So I was just thinking, I mean, it's an ideal place. It's got accommodation, it's got kitchens, it's got gyms, everything there. It's got first aid there. Everything there is ready to go, and they could use it tomorrow because it's still active.
Two problems.
Yes.
Don't say it like that. First is there's already a shortage of prison officers, so that the prison service is already understaffed, and nobody joined the military police to guard civilian prisoners.
No, true.
So you'd have a struggle with that, and I'm slightly unnerved by your use of the word condemned as well.
Well, yeah, okay.
I don't know whether that necessarily makes it suitable from I mean, I think the original construction dates back to 1431.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
so I mean, not a lot of people are going to have much sympathy for prisoners, such as the nature of coverage of these issues in our country, but it's unlikely to be immediately deployable. It's the sort of thing, if they decide to go down the route of creating more prison places rather than trying to reduce the number of people being convicted of crimes by being a bit more rehabilitative and forward thinking and joined up, as an earlier caller said, then maybe that would be a way in. But I don't think in the short term that's going to be ready for purpose yesterday.
No, okay.
I like it. Is it nice? Is it worth a visit?
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, it's got a HMS Alliance, which is an old Second World War period diesel submarine, which you can go on and get a tour. It's got a submarine museum. It's actually the home of the submarines. Started in 1901.
Good Lord.
And it closed in 2001, so it was there for 100 years.
It's beautiful as well, isn't it? It's a stunning piece of sort of architecture, marine architecture. I stayed in a place many years ago, just to go off on a complete tangent. I stayed in a place called Fort Picklecombe. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I can't tell.
That's like I mean, it's apartments now. It's been turned into accommodation, but there are probably, I mean, I don't know whether or not old buildings are suitable for transformation into new prisons, but we can certainly derive pleasure from the buildings, even if we can't turn them into prisons. Paul, thank you, mate. Liz is in Cricklade. Liz, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Liz.
I think the government should communicate better about what happens in our system. I have been a victim of a very bad crime. My son was attacked under the last Labour government, I will say, in 2007. 13 of them were convicted. I have been through them going to jail, and I have been through them coming out of jail. And it is unrealistic of everyone to think that once someone goes to jail, that's over, they're never going to come out. And most people, they go to jail and you want them to get better. And part of that process is the victim, and this is what the last Labour government were working towards, restorative justice and getting you together. I have sat with the people that attacked my son and have been part of their coming back into society. And that was the most cathartic moment for me. I found the whole prison thing awful. And, that's what we need to work, instead of blaming everybody else.
You're right, and I know you're right, and most people listening know you're right, but as with every other suggestion, this isn't something that could have been implemented yesterday.
No, and the other thing is, as in throwing loads of people at farms, was the main reason that I rang.
Yes, I thought it might be.
Ultimately, farms are highly skilled workplaces, and there is, and this last government have done untold damage to our public services, but there are some very, very good people out there who know exactly what they're doing.
And James Timpson, arguably one of them, who has, of course, been elevated into the House of Lords and given. So this is, the only way that this, in the long term, works to Keir Starmer's favour is if it is seen as a sort of clearing of the decks before he gets on with the business of the kind of root and branch reform that you want to see. Let me read you something from a pal of mine who does volunteer work in this sector. They write, at least 1 in 10 prisoners let out have probation meetings that they cannot meet. So they might be let out of Featherstone in Wolverhampton at 10 a.m. and have to be at a probation meeting in Kent by midday. If a prisoner doesn't phone to let them know that they can't make it, they will be back inside. Lots of prisoners can't read or understand probation terms, and they may not have a phone, etc. They've then got to find their way around an unfamiliar city with not a great deal of cash. A lot of this is very easily solved, but cuts have made it very difficult. Good show, James. I'm off to eat a cat. So these are the points. These are the points that we should all be talking about as a country. But hey ho, the Daily Mail. One of the prisoners got picked up in a Lamborghini.
But, we have a system which is from the Victorian days, where everyone's there going, "We're me, criminal," and having lived through it and sat in the courtroom and gone through it all, I can't tell you how awful it is, and you feel as a victim as feasted on as everybody else. Yes. The system needs modernising, and we all have to take responsibility for it to ensure that system is upheld in some way. But the sort of throwing away and the mental attitude that you get from reading the red tops and they did this and
well, that leads inevitably
you're in trouble with Farage again today. He wants an apology from you. Excellent. Everybody wanting information. It's a very, very volatile situation when you're thrown into a violent crime in particular, and people need to be sensitive about it and think about it cohesively rather than just from they're awful, throw them in a dungeon and throw away the keys. It isn't that.
Which leads us to the current leader of the Conservative leadership battle, Robert Jenrick, saying the solution is simple, something simple. The solution is simple, build more prisons and lock up prolific offenders for longer. So do more of what we're doing now. It's a bit Brexity, isn't it? Just double down, just believe more, just keep doing the things that aren't working. Harder, fail better, to paraphrase Samuel Beckett. Finally, Liz, is your son, is he doing okay? Is he traumatic experience for him?
He'll probably kill me saying this, but he's just had his first child this morning.
Oh, good Lord. So you've got a grandchild for you.
Yes.
How exciting.
And we're very lucky that he survived. So we're very lucky that Ewan is here today. So,
congratulations! What a happy conclusion to an unhappy conversation. Thank you, Liz. It's 10:45. If you don't know Liz, who is a regular on LBC, she very, very active in the field of British farming and sticking up for the interests of British farmers. 10:45 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I may catch up with Lewis Goodall shortly on last night's debate in America, and with a bit of luck, that might involve a few more illuminating clips as well.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:48 is the time. I'm given that it is one of my key obsessions. It's a little surprising to find myself this morning and yesterday, I don't know if you heard the penny drop yesterday, honestly thinking now that the welfare of the country depends upon the current government's ability to detach itself from an obsession with increasingly moribund and dying right-wing media coverage. So the front pageophobia that successive governments have suffered from, including Tony Blair, by the way, albeit that he was a little bit more robust in his resistance. He was not robust in his relationships with Rupert Murdoch, ending up godfather to one of Rupert Murdoch's children. But if the Labour Party can press ahead with policies that are designed to improve the country and ignore the ludicrously inflammatory and freakishly dishonest headlines that have typified newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, I don't know that the Daily Express counts, but in many ways they're even madder. We know that Boris Johnson spent his life second-guessing, obsessing about what reception he would receive in those relatively tiny places. It's no coincidence that he ended up as a columnist at one of them and used to be a columnist at the other. They think that is the extent of the world, the parameters of the known universe. What have the right-wing media said? But if you're lying and they're lying, everybody loses. So Starmer's, I think, government depends on detaching themselves from these kind of things. And that's why our phone-ins are so fascinating at the moment, because when you actually talk about the facts and the realities, things emerge, like the fact no one has got the first idea what the government could have done differently from what they have done. Everybody listening to this programme knows that the problems we're looking at now are a direct consequence of not only 14 years of Tory rule, but also Rishi Sunak deliberately ignoring and disregarding pleas from his own ministers and the most senior police officers in the country to implement precisely the policy that Keir Starmer's implementing now. So if people aren't telling you that, you've got to wonder about what else you shouldn't have trusted them on. Nevertheless, you can always rely on Donald Trump to raise a smile. No, hang on a sec. Which clip are we looking at? Number 3, please, Keith.
Our country is being lost. We're a failing nation. And it happened 3.5 years ago. And what's going on here, you're going to end up in World War III, just to go into another subject. What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
I tell you what, that Joe Biden, he was losing the plot, wasn't he? I should tell you that immediately after that interesting contribution to international public discourse, the host of the event said that officials in Springfield had made it absolutely clear there are no reports whatsoever of people in Springfield eating cats or dogs. I nearly said cats and dogs, but cats or dogs. Trump insisted that he had, and I quote, seen it on TV. Anyone else thinking of The Simpsons at the moment, or is that just me? Either way, don't have a cow. Lewis Goodall is, of course, the presenter of Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC and the presenter of the Newsagents podcast. Is it fair to say he has an unhealthy interest in politics in general and American politics in particular? What did you make of last night, Lewis?
Well, look, James, I think if you look at the two debates of this election, which have been both in their different ways been remarkable debates. I mean, you can look at them as two respective separate tales of two different old men failing very publicly in very different ways, and showing, I think, the electorate, or at least planting the seed in the minds of the electorate, that they're no longer up to the job. We saw obviously unravel catastrophically with Biden. I think last night basically went as well as it could have gone for Harris. And I suppose if you were to try and sum it up, I don't know why you would want to do this, but if you were going to sum it up in, say, an emoji, in one single emoji, then I think you would probably sum it up with the old fishing rod emoji with a fish at the end of it. Because what was very clear throughout is that Harris had a strategy, which was to bait Trump, which was to knock him off course, which was to exploit his vulnerabilities and his neuroses and his sort of inner angst about different things and knock him off course, which she did repeatedly on issue after issue. The best example being of all the one you've already referred to, where what should have been extremely strong territory for him about immigration, a question about immigration, Harris answered first, just got a sneaky little reference into the idea that maybe his crowd sizes were diminishing, that maybe people were starting to disappear by the end of them because they were nonsensical. What does Trump do? Instead of just ignoring that, which a more skilled candidate would have done, or more skilled debater would have done, I should say, instead of just ignoring it and hitting their talking points, he goes off on a rant about some random town in the middle of Ohio where illegal migrants eat cats and dogs. So, you know, as well as having a sort of long rant about how his crowd sizes were the biggest possible. So I don't think it could have gone much better for Harris than it did. Of course, whether it sort of shifts things permanently is another question. Hillary Clinton was widely perceived to have won the debates in 2016. Didn't mean that she won the presidency. But I think in a situation where momentum was stalling for Harris post-convention, and she needed to try and regain a little bit of momentum, I think she would have done that last night.
Well, yes. Who is in play here? Because I don't know, given what we already witnessed, that anybody who is yesterday, at lunchtime yesterday, anybody who was still signed up to Donald Trump's ticket, I don't know that anything is going to detach them from Donald Trump's ticket. The man's a multiple felon, adjudicated rapist. We've all heard the tapes of him boasting about committing sexual assault. We're familiar with the way that he maligned Gold Star families and mocked disabled journalists. We know that the man is, by any objective measure, utterly contemptible. So a poor debate performance isn't going to be the straw that breaks many camels' backs, is it?
Well, there are. Look, the American electorate, as we know, goes without saying, highly polarized. It is remarkable how resilient, as you refer to, James, Trump's coalition is in some ways, considering everything we know about him. He still always can rely on between 44, 45, 46% of the electorate. That is no mean thing, and you can't underestimate the extent to which some of that is about his political virtues, in the sense that, for example, for whatever reason, he manages to command 66% of the non-college educated white vote. That makes it very hard when you consider that's 40% of the electorate overall. That means it's very hard for any candidate actually to beat him. That said, the thing that she had to try and do was to, if you think about the kind of stages of her campaign, she takes over from Biden when Democrats are flatlining. Trump is way ahead. Just by her entry into the race, she manages to put the Democrats back into contention and get to roughly level pegging with Trump. She manages to reassemble a lot of, but crucially not all, of the Democratic winning coalition that put Biden over the top in 2020. And what's really interesting is if you look at the polls, she has still been, although she's done better with that coalition, she's still been doing not as well as Biden did in 2020 with several key groups: black voters, Latino voters, young voters. According to all of the polls, a large percentage of them wanted to see more of Harris and give more of a sense of herself and introduction to herself. So if she has managed to do, there is a long way of saying, there is perhaps a surprising number of people who you would think would be in one camp or the other who were not attached last night. The other thing she had to do, which I think that she did succeed in doing, whether it stays like this is another question. There's a general feeling that if this is an election about where the economy is, about where immigration is, about some of these policy issues, Trump wins. Because for whatever reason, and we didn't need to detain us about whether it's true or not, there is a sort of feeling, and Trump has been very skillful in kind of creating this impression, that all of these things were much better when he was president, right? But if it's a referendum, and if this is an election, is a referendum on Trump and his capacity, then Harris wins. And last night was, I think, no doubt, wherever you stand on the two candidates, and Harris certainly has her weaknesses, it was a living kind of embodiment of the problems with another Trump presidency and candidacy, and a study of his lack of capacity and perhaps diminishing capacity in a way that is somewhat akin to what happened with Biden by comparison to even where he was 4 or certainly 8 years ago when he first ran in 2016.
That's an acute observation. What are Harris's weaknesses then? Because two questions really in conclusion. What would those weaknesses be? Were they on display last night? And are there going to be any more debates?
So yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of personal weakness, which is that she can be somewhat vague. She can be a little waffly. She doesn't necessarily have, in terms of the sort of clear responses that you might expect from a candidate. I think some of that is because she's got into it quite quickly. She hasn't had all that time to kind of hone it. We kind of forget that. I think the biggest weakness she has is one that she perhaps can't do that much about, which is that this is such a weird election, right? In the sense that, according to all of the polls, Americans want this to be a change election. Now, normally in any election, the change candidate is obvious because it's the person who's not in office. Yes. But what's weird about this is that you have two versions of incumbency, right? I mean, there's the vice president who isn't incumbent, so she's in a difficult position of having to kind of defend the Biden record, but at the same time promise change. Bear in mind that it's difficult for vice presidents to do. It's probably one of the reasons that only 4 sitting vice presidents since the foundation of the Republic have become president from office. And indeed, most of those happened in the early 19th century. The last one, most recent one, was George H.W. Bush in 1988. For a country that's kind of a bit addicted to kind of renewal and change, political renewal, it's kind of quite hard for a sitting vice president to do. So that's number one. But she has an advantage in another sense, which is that Trump is also a bit of an incumbent, in the sense that it's very unusual to have a former president running for office, highly unusual. So whoever can kind of wrest the change mantle is in a really good position. The polling so far, though, has suggested that actually most American voters, again, for whatever reason, associate Trump with the idea of being change and Harris with being continuity. And if that happens, and if that's the general impression up to election day, you have to say that Trump was certainly before last night favoured. On the question of whether there'll be another debate, I mean, who knows? I mean, Harris called for one immediately, and Harris campaign immediately. That's
significant. That means they've read. That means they know where the laurels lie, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought the Trump campaign would be reluctant on the basis of what happened last night.
But his pride, perhaps, will be pricked.
Indeed.
Ooh,
So
it's all to play for.
If we're on Fox, but then Harris wouldn't do it. So.
No, because Fox, of course, has a long history of deliberately manipulating information and reporting things in favour of Donald Trump, for which they were fined, I think, somewhere in the region of it doesn't quite work like that. They were sued by the voting machine makers after their coverage of Donald Trump's claims regarding the last election. How significant is Taylor Swift's intervention, Lewis Goodall?
Wow, now I knew you'd do this to me. Look, I can't even think of one of our songs.
Come on, mate, shake it up.
Yeah, shake it up. Oh, there we go. I was up to date. Look, I think Swift did shake it up, whatever. Look, she did endorse Biden in 2020. It's true that, my understanding is she's even bigger since then. It is absolutely true to that. And I thought what was smart about it, what's clearly learned about it, is that she could have just said, I'm endorsing Kamala Harris, and Tim Walz. But obviously, she invoked J.D. Vance and the now infamous cat lady comment, basically saying as a cat lady herself. And I think that in the sort of meme era that we live in, you can't underestimate it. And the same way that the biggest success last night actually was that for Harris was that, obviously tens of millions of Americans will have been watching it, but most Americans will obviously see it chopped up and clipped up through the variety of clips that go around TikTok and social media else, but particularly younger voters. And on that score, Harris won absolutely hands down because she had about 6 very strong clips. And Trump's best clip, or most sort of notable clip, was his talking about immigrants consuming household pets.
Cats and dogs. Thank you, Lewis Goodall, as always. I suppose you could say that the bad blood between Taylor Swift and Donald Trump would be beyond Kamala Harris's wildest dreams. Indeed, she may consider the intervention to be gorgeous. You have to remember, however, that Donald Trump remains something of an anti-hero in the minds of many Americans, and so the situation is, of course, delicate. I think that probably we or you need to calm down. And there's a special prize for anybody who spotted all of the Taylor Swift song titles in that little concluding comment.
James O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes after 11 is the time. I did 2 things, actually, before we launch our new conversation. The first is what Lewis said a moment ago about Trump's popularity among non-college educated Americans. Was it 60 or 66%? That speaks directly to the conversation we had recently about the relationship between class and degrees, doesn't it? I think it was on Monday, wasn't it? Why was Rishi Sunak so keen to discourage people from going to university? There is your answer. Because if you don't go to college, if you don't move into tertiary education, where critical thinking becomes more important than just learning stuff by rote or lower level third gear education, the higher the level of education you achieve, the less likely you are to fall for right-wing rhetoric and right-wing lies. So why would Rishi Sunak not want your children to go to university? Because if they don't go to university or college, they're more likely to be supportive of a politician like Donald Trump. Make of that what you will. And speaking of people who are supportive of Donald Trump, presumably, here's an interesting insight into how their minds work from Chris in Watford. He writes, James, you are dishonest. Springfield police in a statement said they had heard the rumours but have had no confirmed reports. That is not saying it is not happening. Well, what I read out was that the officials in Springfield had said there are absolutely no reports of this happening whatsoever, but Trump insisted he had seen it on TV. So a rumour, Chris, I mean, I don't know if I can help you. If you've taken the trouble to actually write into a radio station with that level of silliness, I don't know that I can help you. But if there are no reports of it, then the man on the radio who just said there are no reports of it can't be a liar. Do you see, Chris? No? Okay. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Here is a story I find really interesting. and profoundly important, but a little bit tricky. We did a phone-in many moons ago, long before you started listening to the programme, about the perception of British youth as being a little bit work-shy. And I took a call from someone who I had managed to really upset. It's a lovely young woman who I think was working in a cinema at the time, but had desires to be a graphic designer. We tried to help her out a bit with the second course after she got in touch, because she was really cross, really upset with me. And as you know, there's nothing I hate more than unintentionally upsetting people. Intentionally upsetting people, whoa, hold my coat all day long. Absolutely love it. Unintentionally upsetting people is if you're even half engineered, if you're half decent. Unintentionally upsetting people should give you pause, and then you can sit and work out whether or not that offence was something you should be worried about or apologise for, or something you should double down on and insist was actually fair. And the portrayal of young people as being lazy is unfair, right? I want to start with that observation, because we're about to veer into slightly tricky territory. The portrayal of young people as being lazy is, I believe, unfair. Something more subtle, more nuanced, more sophisticated is going on, because the figures are fairly frightening. 13.3% in the 3 months to July was the official figure for youth unemployment. And it's an intervention by Matthew Taylor, who led the Number 10 policy unit under Tony Blair and is now the chief executive of the NHS Confederation. He was the head of the Royal Society of the Arts, the RSA, for a while, actually. So I met him a couple of times when I was doing events there. He's a galaxy brain. He's one of those people who, 4D chess kind of character, very engaging man. And he often says things that I find really interesting and thought-provoking. And he has addressed directly what he describes as a very negative view of work among young people. This is very different from laziness or fecklessness. It's a negative view of work. Post-pandemic, the rise in youth inactivity and unemployment, because they're not necessarily the same thing, has been exponential. He talks of the need for a complex cross-government approach, or rather he describes the reasons behind the post-pandemic rise in youth inactivity and unemployment as complex. That's why I'm rejecting the notion of mere laziness, and calls for a cross-government approach. So I want to directly address this phrase here. I think some young people have a very negative view of what working life is, and a lot of their friends have responded by becoming economically inactive. It makes it more likely that the next person will do that. It's a big figure. And part of Keir Starmer's biggest challenges, getting people who aren't working but can work to work, while not, of course, forgetting or ignoring the people who aren't working because they can't work. Long-term sickness, long COVID, sundry other conditions that receive neither the attention nor the treatment that they deserve. But we talk today about young people who can work but don't want to. Okay? Can work but don't want to. Young people. So I've got two problems with this, or at least two areas of interest. There's the why of it and the what of it, essentially. So the why of it is, why do they have such a negative view of work? And here's the real worry. Is that fair enough in 2024? You know, when you survey the options open to you, I mentioned to you some Financial Times analysis that they shared at their festival this weekend, showing that for young men who don't go to university, who don't go on into further education, life chances go off a cliff almost immediately. I haven't been able to find it in print form, digestible print form. I've only got a clip of the actual speech that was given by John Byrne-Murdoch at the weekend, and there's paywalls involved and all sorts of things. But I'm sure I'll find it one day soon and share it with you. But the idea that people look at the options open to them, young people look at the options open to them, and come away monumentally unimpressed. I I find it hard to get cross with them, you know. I find it hard to sort of crack the whip or reach for some of those lazy tropes that I may once have reached for, which is, well, they'll soon understand the importance of getting a job if they've got no food in their belly. I don't think I'd ever have reached for quite that vulgar a trope, but do you know what I mean? We do this thing. How many times have I said to you recently, you've got to stop looking at problems facing 19-year-olds today through your own 19-year-old eyes. The world has changed beyond recognition, particularly in the relationship between worker and workplace. So you cannot imagine yourself. Well, when I was 19, I worked on a build. When I was 16, I worked on a building site. When I was 17, I worked as a waiter. When I was 18, I worked behind a bar. I always had a job in a shop during my holidays from university. That's all true. That's all great. But it doesn't matter because you're not 19 now. My personal experiences recently in this field include an 18-year-old of my acquaintance getting their first job and turning up to do shifts in hospitality, and the shifts are exactly, I think, 5.5 hours long, whatever the threshold is, at which point you get paid 20-minute break and fed. The shift stops half an hour before that. So you go off to your first ever paid shift, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and realise almost immediately that in a sense you're being exploited. Why is the shift ending at such an odd time? Oh, because if we did half an hour more, if it moved into that final half an hour, they'd have to give us a 20-minute break and some dinner. I appreciate you've got 3,000 people catering various events across the country. Then that's 3,000 times dinner and 3,000 times a 20-minute paid break. But what does the 18-year-old take away from that? What sense of value or respect for themselves do they take away from an obviously exploitative arrangement? I don't know. But I don't want to reach for lazy put-downs of young people. Why are so many of them forming a very negative view of what working life is? Okay? That's the question. You look at working life, I think crucially you look at the options that are realistically open to you, and you think to yourself, nah. You think to yourself, what's the point? And in many ways, if you want to come on and give them a bit of a kicking, you're going to have to answer that question. What's the point? This is nice from Ash. Here you go, James. Starting salary, $1,500 a month after tax. Rent, $1,000 a month. Bills, $400 a month. So why should I work when I see online streamers making hundreds of pounds a day playing games and having fun? Answer, Ash, is if you don't, you're going to be living with your mum for the rest of your life. And that brings us to the second question, which is the what of it, not the why of it. So why have young people developed such a negative, so many young people, not all, developed such a negative approach to the simple practice of work? 0345 606 0973. And then what do you do? I mean that genuinely. I mean it almost from a place as much of sympathy as curiosity. What do you do if you're not working and you're not in school? What do you actually do? What does your son do? I know you're worried about him. And I know you think he should be doing more than this. You know he's better than this. You kind of possibly understand why he's developed such a negative view of work. But what does he do? The life must be so limited. I don't know what welfare he would be entitled to, but the days of being able to secure income support and housing benefit are long, long, long behind us. So he gets a few quid, does he, for universal credit, or nothing at all because he can't prove that he's looking for work? So he relies on you to give him 20 quid on Friday nights to go to the pub. What does he do the rest of the week? What is life like for the 13.3% of British youth that is currently unemployed, either through circumstance or choice? And in some ways, it's the choice category that I'm more interested in. What explains the negative view of work? Is it as simple as Ash suggests? It's Mr. McCorber territory. You add up your income, compare it to what your outgoings would be if you flew the nest, and you can't see the point. In which case, why do some people do it while others don't? And then the second question, of course, becomes, what is life like for young people who have arrived at the conclusion that working life is not worth it, or not for them. Here are Matthew Taylor's words once again before we go to the phones. A lot of their friends have responded by becoming economically inactive. And that makes it more likely that the next person will do that as well. You are either economically inactive yourself and young and able to answer one or both of these questions, or you're listening to someone describe your child. And that must be tough. I never, ever, ever criticise other people's parenting, or at least I try not to anymore. It was a bit difficult the other week, wasn't it, when the young woman was in Ibiza as her 14-year-old boy was getting jailed for his involvement in the Farage riots. I never do, because of their but for the grace of God go I. I don't think any of us, once you become a half-decent parent, any of us believe we can control much of what our children do or where they go, but that must be awful. What do they do? What is life like? And Cam accuses me of looking at that last comment through my 19-year-old eyes when I suggested going down the pub with 20 quid. Yeah, all right, I take your point. That'd be what, 3 pints, would it, in a pub in the southeast? Yeah, I think so. No, not quite. You wouldn't even get 3, 2.5 at a push, 2. Maybe 2 pints and a packet of crisps. It is 19 minutes after 11. Sorry, that took rather longer. It turns out I care a lot more about this even than I realised. And that is the point. Why have they arrived at the conclusion that why have they arrived at such negative conclusions about work? And what do they do instead? Hit the numbers now, you will get through.
This is LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 21 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we're looking for two things. The reasons why young people have arrived at the conclusion that working life is not worth it, well, not for them, and what they do instead. John's in Manchester. John, what would you like to say?
Hello there.
Hello,
I'm only 29 myself, but I work with...
It's not that young, mate.
Well, it's all relative, isn't it?
Yes, it is all relative. There you go. Hoist by my own petard. Go on.
But there's some people I work with, late teens, early 20s, and they don't see effective career progression. They see themselves doing these jobs in hospitality, and they can't envisage themselves working it long time, and they can't properly commit themselves to training or the careers that take a long time to build up, because they need money to pay the bills and money to pay for food.
What was different about you?
I fell into it by accident.
Into what?
I graduated into the career.
Okay.
Alcohol retail, because I was able. Well, I fell out of uni. Graduated uni just before COVID hit. Right. Couldn't speak my career, and then I ended up doing this work and found a passion for it.
And saw a path ahead, saw a career progression.
Yeah, I built it myself. But when you come out with, it's no shame to people who don't see that vision. I was supported in some ways to get there, to find my passion. But if you're just newly minted out of school, you don't really have skills or money to your name, and you enter some sort of menial work to tick along by. Where do you go from there?
How many of your friends are you describing?
Half a dozen. Dozen.
That's quite a lot. And what do they do instead? Do you understand why? I don't want to sound like the Grandpa Simpson shouting at the clouds, but what do they do? How do they fill their days?
It's work, and it's not working. I mean, it's so emotionally draining, the work being undertaken for some of us, that there's nothing you can do outside of work other than
what do the people who aren't
misery?
What do the people who aren't working do? What do they?
I don't know. I don't have time to socialise with them because I'm too busy working.
But they're still living at home, I presume, and relying on mum and dad, or mum or dad, to feed them and clothe them, and then occasionally subsidise some social life. That's the bit I don't get. I don't think it's.
Well, no, I mean, so we it's the case. They'll pop in. They'll get a couple of shifts a week,
but they don't count as being unemployed. They don't count as being unemployed.
Right, but
13.3% unemployed. God knows how many are in the category that you're describing.
Trying to find a job, you get a couple of shifts, and you're like, "No, that's not for me." Then you go back to being unemployed. If you're working for less than a month, you're not really employed, are you?
No, but you get such a pittance now if you're a young single person on unemployment benefit. You probably aren't. A lot of people won't even be claiming it because of the requirements to prove that you're actually looking for work and the rest of it. So when I was your age, when I was 10 years younger than you could sign on and get income support and housing benefit and have a modest, a pleasant lifestyle. You could live a life of borderline hedonism, sleep all day, go out at night. If you knew people on the doors at clubs, you literally could live like that. People put bands together. Sean Ryder talks about how there would be no Happy Mondays if it wasn't for income support. Those days are over, so I don't know what they do all day.
Maybe you speak to one of them.
Yeah, I know. Take care, John, and good luck with the business. Heather's in Watford. Heather, what made you pick up the phone?
Hiya. Well, I mainly picked up the phone just because, obviously, I come from a background of a very hardworking family. My dad served in the NHS for 45 plus years until he passed away at 65 from cancer. So he worked 70-hour weeks, sometimes 80, 90-hour weeks, and we barely really see him. And I just remember, obviously, his ambition and everything is what kept me going into wanting to be educated and have a good job and, work my way up this whole rat race. But one of the main things that really hit me before he passed away is that he was saying how it was all for nothing. And even though I couldn't comprehend at the time what that meant, now, 5 years later, being, in the rat race, working 40-hour weeks, barely having time to myself, and most of my money going towards rent, bills, council tax, all these things, I'm kind of starting to realize it feels like it's all for nothing. While a lot of my colleagues and stuff, they, their lives kind of revolve around work. Everything is about work and how proud they are about work. But in reality, I'm proud of just my family. I'm happy to have that time with them, and I know how precious time is, especially my husband almost lost his life this year, and that put everything into perspective, to be honest.
Yeah, but you haven't got a great deal. I suppose I'm interested also in the choice. I wouldn't have thought you had much choice but to carry on the treadmill that you describe, and yet 13.3% of your generation and younger have kind of opted out, as it were.
I think most of those people that have the luxury to opt out will have very nice parents or have sorted themselves out in terms of being in the benefits council system.
There's not a lot. There's not much there now. There was when I was your age, but there isn't now. And you don't need very nice parents. You just, if you're going to live in your room all day, you just need to know that they're going to feed you. That's pretty much it.
Exactly, but to be honest, that's a luxury, and that is still a luxury that probably a lot of younger people don't realise.
I think you might be right. Be interested to see how the class or socioeconomic statistics broke down on this. Final question, Heather.
Yeah.
Do you think you would feel differently if you were paying a mortgage rather than paying rent?
I think at least I would be more motivated if I was paying a mortgage. I mean, my rent is ridiculous, $1,600, and it's absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, at least if it was going towards an asset that I would one day own,
then you could see the point. Although I see why your late father's words haunt you. I mean that and what he was describing was a sense of having neglected. No one on their deathbed looks back and wishes they'd worked more, I don't think.
Exactly. And even though he was very respected in the NHS and all of these things and had a lot of accomplishments, at the end of the day, you don't take those accomplishments with you. All you do get to take is the memories of your family, your loved ones, and all the little things you did in life, not your promotions or anything like that.
And you speak as someone who is, by their own definition, in the rat race, and yet and yet you make the so much easier for those of it, for everybody listening, to understand why so many people have chosen not to be. Heather, take care. Thank you for that. This is nice from Steve, who's in Wyndham, and I imagine he'll be slightly surprised at how perfectly I just pronounced Wyndham, because it is one of those English place names that seems designed to confuse foreigners. Steve's just done a calculation of his wages and what they were worth in 1986. And he reckons there'd be about 150 quid on top of what he'd get now for doing the same job. And that 150 quid was my pint at the pub with a kebab after. But that's a figure of speech. That was the life money. So you've got survive money, right? And then you've got living money. And increasingly, as a consequence of political decisions driven by Tufton Street flavoured ideology and sold by the same people that sold you Brexit, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, austerity, the idea that the reason why you can't afford a decent life is because of someone in a boat in the middle of the English Channel, all the effort put into persuading you of that. They've reduced so many people, and the younger you are, the more accurate this is as a description of you. If you do go to work in a normal job, you get survival money. You don't get living money. At which point you can understand why, if the option is there to turn around and say, sack it, I'm out, you can perhaps begin to understand why people do. 11:30 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:33 is the time. Heather's words really resonated with me, James. I'm 48. I spent 30 years working non-stop in order to pay off the mortgage. Now that I've done so, I work just enough to pay the bills and fund my travels. I'm, quotes, only, end quotes, a cleaner, but I've been to 9 different countries this year. I don't want to waste any more years working more hours. I never stop thinking that death is waiting for us at the end, isn't waiting for us at the end of a long road. He walks away with us, holding our hands every step of the way. And at any time, he might decide to let go. By virtue of the fact I have paid my mortgage, I can now live this way. I don't know how those that will forever be renting must feel, but I can imagine a what's the point attitude is completely understandable. This is, arguably one of the most interesting issues of our day, of our era. And as a few of you, I love it when an observation that I've made has seeped so far into the discourse that you quote it back at me without possibly, I think we didn't come up with this. It's too obvious for us to have come up with, but I certainly thought of it on the programme and hadn't seen it anywhere else, which was when you say to someone, I just said to the last caller, would you feel any better if you were paying a mortgage rather than paying rent? Of course, she is paying a mortgage. She earns enough money to pay a mortgage, but she's paying someone else's. Because post-financial crisis, we remain in a situation where if you can't get the deposit together, if you can't save enough money, and looking at the simple breakdown of how much is going on rent and bills, you're not going to be able to without help, then you can't get on the housing ladder. That's something that Labour could look at. And in fact, we will find out later today a little more about what they're planning to do to the renting system, which I think underpins a lot of this problem. It's 11:35. PMQs with us at 12, of course. Natasha will be steering us into that experience just before 12. After that, quite important to tell you that Edward Daffan will be joining us. Edward, of course, was one of the founders of the Grenfell Action Group, which predicted in grisly detail what was almost certainly, and I use that word almost cautiously. They would probably not include it. And the Grenfell Action Group predicted with grisly accuracy what would happen in the event of the tenants management organisation at Grenfell Tower not taking their concern seriously. And of course, he's someone who has figured in much of the fallout as an exemplar of the contempt with which, I don't want to say whistleblowers because it sounds too, people, residents with concerns, how contemptuously they were treated by some of the people who came out rather badly from Sir Martin Morbick's report last week. Edward will be with us at 12:30, just after 12:30. If you want to send him a message or you want me to put anything to him, then let me know in all the usual ways. And after that, an old pal of mine from way, way back in the day, Andy Bell, the political editor of Channel 5 News, who has risen to a challenge that I probably should have set myself and written a thriller about Brexit. We'll find out a little bit more about that and possibly about his daughter, who was one of the great shining lights of the Olympic Games, of the British performance at the Olympic Games. So lots to come on the programme. Why have so many young people developed such a negative view of working life? Working life. Billy's in Nottingham. Billy, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Big fan.
Thank you.
I would just like to basically voice my annoyance every time this comes up, yes. Because for people my age, I'm 27, it's no wonder people are feeling I think complacent's the wrong word, just depressed in general about everything, because we've spent, me personally, and I think everybody has spent their entire life growing up in what, I can't remember the last time we weren't in a financial crisis.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we have COVID hit us, and no wonder we've got an epidemic of mental health issues.
Yes.
And at the end of all that, a lot of us are looking at it financially ruined. I'm living with my parents. Thank God I've got like a food and a bed to go back to.
Yes.
But it's hopeless for us. I'm never going to be able to own a house. Well, I'd be surprised if I am.
Right.
And at the end of the day, there just seems no point in putting effort into things anymore. And it is a massive mental health crisis with people my age, falling into this trap of where the hell do I go from here?
I think,
and having no answers.
I think
nobody can give you an answer.
No, well, no one can give me an answer either. However many times I ask the question, but what you remind us of, and this is really important, I'm so glad you were listening, is that this is no fun for the people in these categories. Even if there's an element of opting out based upon the perceived futility of opting in, it's not a life of Riley. It's not a sort of, a life of lions and breakfasts in bed. It's, as you say, it's a profoundly depressing experience.
Not being able to get yourself out of bed and go do the things you need to be doing.
Yeah.
And it's only recently, over the last few years, I was diagnosed as bipolar, and I've only just started. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've only just started dealing with that over the last few months.
Well done.
And it's something that it's a type. Loads of my friends and loads of people my age are having to deal with it, and we've got nothing. There's nothing we can do except grit our teeth and hope that things will get better, and they probably won't, but there's nothing else we can do.
So I mean, in terms of the rat race, as I think Heather described it, the simple equations, the income versus the outgoings, renders it borderline ridiculous to even engage in, or
Absolutely. I was over lockdown. I was living in a flat in city centre.
Yeah,
and I think I was working full time, just over minimum wage, and I could just barely afford to the flat and the bills with the people I was living with. I had about maybe 200 quid a month to go spend freely as I would like to. It's not enough, and it just depresses my entire generation.
And when they talk about economic growth, of course, or when they talk about us being the biggest, fifth, sixth biggest economy in the world, they're talking about the sum total of all the money, and what we've seen.
They're talking about the people that and the companies that benefited from COVID, the people that came out the other end profitable.
Yes, and the individuals.
Just leave us at the bottom of the hill.
How big a part do you think COVID has played in this process? Because every time we turn our attention to attendant subjects, the phrase post-pandemic quickly pops up. Elements of this are post-pandemic, but I see post-pandemic as an exacerbation rather than a root cause.
What it's done is focused a lot of the feel. Like, you think over the last 14 years, we've had basically just been punched in the face continuously by the government, and then all of a sudden, everybody in the country has had a collective traumatic experience. No wonder people are coming out with more and more mental health issues.
Yeah,
and then you got the gall of people trying to tell us that we're lazy. It's just ridiculous. And like I said, I've only just been able to pick myself up and get myself back on the job market.
And 20 years ago, that would have felt like a much more exciting prospect than it does now.
Absolutely.
And it would have given you more to fight for and more to aim for, and that's something that my generation really, really needs to take on board. Billy,
whereas right now, what am I fighting for? I'm going to fight for not being able to get a mortgage, and I was planning on studying abroad before the pandemic, before Brexit. That's not going to happen.
No.
So...
No, what am I fighting for? I mean, you tell him if you want. If you think this is a misrepresentation of of reality or of a common experience, then you tell Billy what he's fighting for. Thank you, mate, because Harry's been in touch with an answer to that question. This is what you'd be fighting for. Hi, James. I'm 22. Finished university last year. I managed to get a graduate job almost immediately, and I'm getting paid what was advertised as a living wage. Works out about £12 an hour. I started renting, but I had to move back with my parents just so that I could have a social life. And I mean, going to the pub, it's not like going to Ibiza. Further, the person, this one stopped me, Harry. I got to be honest. The person in the position above me, in his graduate level job, the person in the position above me has been working at this company for 15 years and is on £2 an hour more than me. Just have a look at the distribution of wealth. It's extraordinary. It's why so many people are so cross with Keir Starmer for going after the winter fuel payments. I'm holding off personally on that comparison. It's a little lazy. But if he doesn't go in some way towards redistribution of wealth in a much more meaningful fashion, then none of these problems are going to be properly addressed. None of them are going to be properly addressed because the people talk about economic growth or they talk about the size of the economy, talking about the sum total of money. What's the point of having a massive economy or having really healthy GDP if almost all of the money is concentrated in a tiny number of hands? What is the point? The only meaningful measure on this is per capita GDP per capita, where I think we struggle. I don't think we're even in the top 25 internationally. So they bang on endlessly, particularly Brexiters who think that comparing us to other countries or the only thing you compare the United Kingdom to work out whether or not Brexit was a good idea is a United Kingdom still in the European Union. And then you make a list of all the things that we could do and you realise why Goldman Sachs estimates about £4 billion a year. Or more, actually. But every estimate from sensible, honest people portrays how much better off we... It doesn't matter what's happening in Germany. They're still in the European Union. If they weren't still in the European Union, then whatever bad things are happening there would be worse. These comparisons are utterly fatuous. But the GDP total is one of the worst statistics, one of the worst measures of all. Because all it tells you is how much money... So let's say there's 100 people in a room, right? 2 of them have got £1 million. And the other 98 have got 50p, right? So the sum total of that, I've done it again, would be £2 million and 49 pence. £49, £2 million and 49 pounds. So that's the size of the economy in that room. It's £2 million and 49 pounds. Over there's another room, there's 100, oh man, I've done it. Keith, why do you let me go off on mathematical based analogies when I haven't got the maths. Right, so 2 people have got £1 million and 98 people have got 50p. And after the break, I'll tell you what is happening in the other room where there are another 100 people who've got a smaller overall economy. Their gross GDP is smaller, but you'll never believe how much each one of those 100 people have got in their pockets. Just give me a minute to work it out.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:48 is the time. So, right, you've got 2 people, you've got 100 people in a room, yeah? You still with me at the back? You've got 100 people in. This is up where with the pint pot and the shot glass, by the way, so you may want to press record. Oh, you don't need to press record. You can listen on Global Player with catch up and rewind and all sorts of other whiz-bang features. So you've got 100 people in a room. 2 of them have got £1 million. And the other 98 have got 50 pence each. The sum total of that economy is £2 million and 49 pounds. In the other room, you've got 100 people and they've all got 15 grand. The sum total of that economy is £1.5 million. I'm positive. I used a calculator. So when they tell you to celebrate the size of GDP, they're not telling you that 2 people in the room have £1 million and you've got 50p. 10 shillings in old money. Whereas over the road, with a smaller GDP of £1.5 million, there's a room with 100 people in it, all of whom have £15,000 in their pocket. And that is why I went to the London School of Economics. And it's also why GDP per capita should be the measure that we insist upon politicians using to tell us how well off we are, rather than how much money there is in the room. It's not much use to us if it's all in the pockets of people like Viscount Rothermere, who owns the Daily Mail, of course, and sundry other people who spend a significant amount of time and energy trying to get you to vote and act against your own interests. 10 to 12 is the time. Back to young people. Yes, you're right. Eleanor just said Paul Johnson at the IFS better watch out. That was economics, that was. It wasn't necessarily sophisticated economics, but sometimes the more digestible a meal is, the more the quicker it can start reaching the parts. Back to young people and their negative attitudes to work. Nikki's in Westminster. Nikki, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I'll try not to get involved with economics.
Oh, you feel free, mate. You can't do any worse than me. Go on.
I just feel, I was saying to your colleague, that I feel it could also, the negative view could come down to how hard the younger people see their parents working.
Yes.
And for what.
Yes.
I just gave the example. For example, I've been away for 7 weeks. I find myself going indoors, complaining about work, fed up of work.
Yeah.
And then without realising it, my 6-year-old daughter, when I'm at home with her and we've got a bit of time off, she's like, "Oh, Daddy, work's boring, isn't it?" And I'm like, it's rubbing off. Yeah. And it's unintentional, but the fact that, we're all out there working hard, trying to make ends meet, and I will caveat it by saying I own my house, I've got a mortgage, and I'm not on the breadline, so I'm grateful for that, but it's still hard work. So when you're coming home every day from work, you're struggling, you're tired, and you're just saying it out loud, but the younger kids, they're picking up on it. So if he's doing it at 6...
What's it going to be like at 6? Now, I'm not going to be like my dad.
When she gets to working age of 18, 12 years down the line, she's like, I don't want to struggle like Dad's been struggling,
And the chances are, as you've just alluded to, that what is within reach for someone putting in the hours that you are putting in will have moved a little bit, or even perhaps a lot further away.
100%.
By the time
100%.
She's your age,
100%. So there's part of the reason I do go and work as hard as I do is to try and give some stability for her later on down the line. So if there are any issues and it is getting harder for work and you're earning less money for more hours, she'll have some stability, hopefully.
And you can't you'd struggle to argue with it, wouldn't you? You'd struggle to sort of say no, because what you'll say is, Daddy has to do this in order for us to have a nice life.
100%.
And she's like, well, maybe I don't want a nice life, which is what the young people, they thought, well, maybe I don't. And also, you don't get enough. Crikey. Good man. Well, take care. Seriously. And try. I don't know what it is, isn't it? Because what she's really saying is, I want more time with my dad.
Just think with work is, the way the 0 hour contracts and all these small contracts, no stability. So that the work-home balance is just not there.
And you can't say no. It's a freelance disease. You just can't say no to stuff, or the 0 hour contract. I'm just going to take a couple of weeks off. Even I, after all these years here, think I better just do that. I better not do that. I've only in the last 5 years have I started saying no. Well, last 10 years saying no to stuff, an increasing amount of stuff as the years have passed. Really hard to do. Thank you, Nikki. Take care. Look after her. 11:53 is the time. Idiot's Corner. We haven't had Idiot's Corner today. Can we have a sound of like a clanging lid? Or a clanging box? Have you got a clanging lid? Keith, have you got a clanging lid sound handy? No? Like a sort of thump. A bit like the opening of Unhinged Headline. Play me Unhinged Headline, quickly.
Unhinged
Does that work?
Headline.
That doesn't work, does it? That's more of a thump. I want a sort of thump, like a shutting thud. A thud. Can you get me a thud? Have we got a thud? A thud, like... Not Elmer Fudd, that's a thud. A thud. I said a thud, not a fud. A shutting. So I go, Mark is making his way into Idiot's Corner, and then bye Mark, and then we hear like a door or a corner. No, this is the content. Do you know what this is? Do you know what this is? This is called content creation. This is, content creation, not just going through the motions of taking phone calls, having a guest, all of that. Content creation is what we're all about. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. Ring the bell. Yeah? Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. And in fact, speaking of YouTube, a special hello to all my American viewers. It's doing extraordinary business in America, my YouTube program, as indeed is the podcast. So I'm really grateful. It's lovely to know that we're being relied upon across the pond for some rather, shall we say, more honest insights into the state of British politics than other outlets may allow. Although Mark's not impressed. He says, "You're on form today." No prizes for guessing how he spells "you're." "You're on form today. Your Marxist outlook spewing all over the airwaves." And that's the voice of someone who wants to have 50p in his pocket and be in a room where two people have £1 million. So you think it's a mythical constituency if you're capable of thinking about things, but Mark is real and adamant that he wants to live in a world where he's got 50p, metaphorically speaking, and 2 people out of 100 in that room have got £1 million each. He doesn't want to live in a world where either everyone has got £15,000, which is a little bit fanciful, or everybody has got a variation on a 5-figure sum from £99,000 right down to £10,000, and the gap between the people with the least, like Mark, and the people with the most is tiny in comparison to what it's like in the room where he wants to have 50p in his pocket while 2 people have £1 million. And what was the thing they used to say, that the devil's greatest job was persuading people? Persuading people that he didn't exist. I think in the context of 21st century politics in this country, the devil's greatest job is persuading people like Mark that they know what the words Marxist and socialist mean, particularly the word socialist. Oh, you're a socialist. Yeah, okay, so are you, mate, if you like the NHS. 11:56 is the time. Dina is in Croydon with the last word on the negative attitudes to work. What would you like to say, Dina?
Hello, hi.
Hello.
I was working
as a waitress in a cocktail bar.
Well, I'm at an education centre for young people aged 16 to 18.
Okay.
And, what I saw is that I think the internet has a lot to do with it.
Really?
Because they're on, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat all day. And
so they're not bored?
They're not bored, and they're seeing, people, content creators, making lots of money and having lots of popularity through just, doing.
Yeah, but I hear this
TikTok.
quite a lot. How long does that last? Because you realise pretty quickly that that's not going to be you. It's a bit like me watching George Michael when I was young and thinking that looks like a nice lifestyle. I think I'll be a pop star. I realised fairly quickly that it ain't going to happen, however many shuttlecocks I put down my trousers.
Well, I mean, I don't know when they're going to grow out of it, because
Right.
I think this is what's going to happen. I think a lot of, young people are looking to get into cybersecurity or things to do with, content creation, anything that's online.
So they're engaged and they're busy, and they genuinely think, and we're never going to be talking about everybody, but you've got experience of talking to several somebodies. They genuinely think that they're embarked upon a path, a career path almost.
Yeah, and streaming. They think that streaming their games, they're playing games, they're having fun, and they're going to make money from it. And
how much do they make?
I don't know.
50p.
I wish I knew.
50p. The fella, you're right, actually. Realistic. And I guess older people don't have the knowledge of the technology or of what you're describing to disabuse them of their notions. I don't know if it's fair. Dina, thank you. But I often think of the talent shows at times like this. It used to be a bit of a lazy trope for people to say, the reason they're not working is they all think they can go on the X Factor and be the next Leona Lewis. And that's what Dina just said, is a kind of equivalent of that. And I was quite dismissive of because you realise if you want to be the next Leona Lewis, you realise pretty quickly that you're not going to. I mean, honestly, you should just watch yourself back on the X Factor to realise how likely it is that some people have extraordinary levels of self-deception and self-delusion, but Nigel Farage can get into the House of Commons in this country. So sometimes these things can be rewarded. But that's the bit I don't get. What did I want to be when an actor? And I saw Michael Sheen in a play, and I thought, oh dear, I don't think you're going to be an actor, mate. You're never going to be that good. But people need to be disabused of some of these dreams. Here's Natasha Clark to disabuse you of your dreams that PMQs will be, what? What are we expecting today, Natasha?
Sorry, I've just been slightly distracted by the idea of shuttlecocks.
That was a George Michael thing that he actually used to do. I didn't just pluck that out of nowhere like a weirdo. So Rishi Sunak versus Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer versus Rishi Sunak.
Yes, and this is one of our last Prime Minister's questions before they go off for their conference break.
They've only been back 10 minutes.
They've only been back 5 minutes and they're already off on yet another break. Who pays these people? Apparently we do. But yes, he's got a raft of topics he could go on today, but I imagine we'll already be hearing quite a lot about prisons and winter fuel. Those are two things I think obviously been completely dominating the news agenda all week. And the idea, and you've obviously spoken about this earlier today, of those pictures on the front page of newspapers of prisoners popping champagne corks and saying that they're going to be back behind bars within days is probably something that
from
Rishi
your
Sunak
days as a tabloid
would like
journalist.
to talk about.
From your days as a tabloid journalist, how likely is it that it was the journalists who turned up with the champagne and handed it to the prisoners?
Gosh, I've genuinely got no idea.
I'd put 50 quid on it right now. Of course I would. Absolutely. People are released from prison every single day. When's the last time you saw a photograph of champagne corks being popped outside the gates?
I think it was that I Heart champagne, according to some of the details in the papers today, which is a pretty cheap bottle, actually. I'm afraid it's not the nice stuff.
Expenses aren't what they used to be, are they?
Exactly. Yeah, can't get these things through anymore.
Is that it? You think? Prisons is going to be tough because we know about the letter that Rishi Sunak got off Mark Rowley and others.
Exactly, because I think Keir Starmer will be more than prepared for an answer on that. We've seen the actual letters in the past sort of 24 hours about the police chiefs that warned him in the days of the election campaign.
You don't hear about this on every LBC show.
You need to trigger this, or this is going to be a real problem for you. And he, of course, decided not to make that decision.
Alex Chalk told him the same thing as well, according to a new book by Anushka Asthani.
There have been reports in the papers at the time, March, April, May.
That's right. And
Alex
even on
Chalk
the winter
was pressuring
fuel
him to do that,
payments,
and he didn't do so.
Even on the winter fuel payments, it was in Theresa May's manifesto to means test winter fuel.
It wasn't in Labour's manifesto, though, was it?
No.
And this is not, arguably, this is not what people voted for. Slashing of budgets, and Rachel Reeves out this morning saying this pain is only going to get more, only going to get worse. There's more to come. Welfare, spending cuts, all on the way. And it's going to be a very tricky budget. So this rebellion that Keir Starmer saw yesterday over winter fuel, 52 Labour MPs abstaining on the policy. We just had that one Labour MP, John Trickett, voting against it. This really is the tip of the iceberg, I think, for Keir Starmer. The rebellions are only going to get worse for him. I don't think there's any chance that things are only going to get... But no, it's not. It's only going to get worse. We've got a really painful budget coming up. We've got some really controversial bits of legislation, including the Trade Union Act obviously being repealed. You've got that workers' rights legislation. There's lots of differentiating voices from across the political spectrum on that. And I think things are just going to get a little bit trickier for Keir Starmer in the coming days. But, he's got such a huge majority. Does it really matter?
No. We will cross, of course, live to the House of Commons the moment that Rishi Sunak gets to his feet. I think I misspoke last week. Or rather, I made a mistake. It was Keir Starmer who kept referring to Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister.
That's an easy mistake to make. We make it all the time.
Well, we must do better.
We will.
And as I say, we'll cross live when the moment he gets to his feet. What's going on with Rishi Sunak? Is he sort of liberated? Is he often? Oh well, we'll find out.
He doesn't quite look like he's got a spirit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join with the Prime Minister in his words about Her late Majesty, the Queen, but also in his words about the Princess of Wales? She's been in the thoughts of everyone across the country, and I know everyone in the House will be delighted and relieved at the progress that she has made. May I also, Mr. Speaker, take this opportunity to pay tribute to Nicholas Howard. This is his last Prime Minister's Questions after supporting 8 consecutive Prime Ministers through these sessions. Never my favourite part of the week, but his commendable service made it far more manageable. Mr. Speaker, yesterday Labour MPs voted to remove the winter fuel payment from over 10 million British pensioners, including those with just £13,000 of income. With that decision debated and made, it is now important that the House understands the full consequences of the government's choice. So can I very specifically ask the Prime Minister, will he now publish the impact assessment before the House rises?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is this. They left a £22 billion black hole. And they hid it from the OBR. Richard Hughes is absolutely clear. It's the largest year-ahead overspend outside of the pandemic. Now, of course, when it comes to mitigations and impacts, we put those in place. Ramping up pension credit, dealing with housing benefit and linking it, something the party opposite didn't do for years. And because of the tough decisions that we're making to stabilise the economy, we can make sure that the triple lock shows that increases in pensions will outstrip any loss of payments. But before he complains about us clearing up his mess, perhaps he'd like to apologise for the £22 billion black hole.
Mr. Speaker, this has got... Mr. Speaker.
I want to hear the question.
Mr. Speaker, when I was in government, I delivered record increases in the state pension. We protected the winter fuel payment and we gave pensioners cost of living benefits. He's the one that's taking money away from pensioners on £13,000, Mr. Speaker. But this has got nothing to do with the public finances. His own Chancellor just this morning, his MPs may not have been listening to her, his own Chancellor this morning admitted that she would prefer it if this policy didn't even raise any money, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, the government would not have made this decision without an impact analysis. And yesterday, the Energy Minister confirmed that. So I ask, very simply again, why won't he publish the assessment now?
Mr. Speaker, I remember the days when the Conservative Party used to be concerned about balancing the books. They've left a £22 billion black hole. Responsibility for this decision lies there. The only way to rebuild our country and invest in our public services and make sure everyone is better off is if we clear up their mess and deal with the £22 billion black hole. But, Mr. Speaker, last week we learned that the Shadow Housing Secretary was calling for means testing of winter fuel payments. Now it turns out that the Shadow Paymaster General agrees with her and even boasted about texting his own mother saying she didn't need the payment. Until he apologises for the mess they've created, he's no position to criticise the action that we're taking.
Mr. Speaker, they're shouting now, but those arguments didn't even convince 50 of his own MPs, who suddenly found that they had urgent business elsewhere yesterday, Mr. Speaker. But we know why he's hiding the impact assessment. The Labour Party's own previous analysis claimed that this policy could cause 3,850 deaths. So are the numbers in his impact assessment higher or lower than that?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're taking this decision to stabilise the economy. That means we can commit to the triple lock. By committing to the triple lock, we can make sure that payments of state pension are higher, and therefore there's more money in the pocket of pensioners, notwithstanding the tough action that we need to take. But he goes around pretending that everything's fine. That's the argument he tried in the election. And that's why he's sitting there and we are sitting here.
Mr. Speaker, today pensioners watching will have seen that the Prime Minister has repeatedly refused to admit or to publish the consequences of his decision, and we will continue holding him account for that. But changing topics, Mr. Speaker, today is Back British Farming Day, where we recognise that British farmers produce food that is higher quality, has higher welfare standards and higher environmental standards than imported food. And at a time of increasing global volatility, they are also crucial for our food security and national security. Can he therefore confirm, whether he will be adopting the NFU's recent proposal to enshrine a national food security target in law?
Prime Minister. Well, food security is really important. I'm glad he's raised that. We have talked to the NFU about this, and rural issues are really important, and that's what we fought the election on, where we've got a lot of rural constituencies sitting behind me now. We'll continue to talk to the NFU. We do take food security very, very seriously.
I'm not sure I did hear a specific answer, Mr. Speaker, but farmers also do great work to preserve the beauty of the British countryside, and something I'm sure that the Prime Minister will appreciate, given his newfound preference for landscapes over political portraiture. But when it comes to land use, there are currently protections in place to ensure that the most productive farmland is used for food production rather than alternatives like solar. So does he agree that it is not appropriate or right that developers with a vested interest grade the quality of that farmland themselves? And will he look at making that process independent?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, rural communities were neglected under the last government. Confidence was at an all-time low. And thousands of food and farming businesses have been forced out of business. Now, of course, we will work with them. Of course, we'll get the balance right. But we're again picking up, clearing up the mess and rebuilding our country.
Mr. Speaker, as a glimpse, in Wales, the Labour government hammered farmers, hitting them with top-down eco-targets. And Labour's own assessment of those plans said that it would lead to thousands of job losses, less food security, and destroy rural incomes, while farmers described it as bleak and damaging. So can he reassure English farmers that he won't threaten their livelihoods, and can he rule out imposing those same top-down targets here?
Prime Minister. We will work with farmers across the whole of the United Kingdom as we've made clear to support them. But here we are, absolutely clear, no contrition, no responsibility for the economic black hole, the broken NHS, the prison crisis, the ruinous legacy of 14 years of failure. We've started rebuilding the country, renters reform, house building, GB Energy, National Wealth Fund, Border Security Command, I could go on. Whilst they try to rewrite history, we're getting on with building a better country for the future.
Madam Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will firstly join me in paying our respects to Lieutenant Rodri Lyshan, who tragically passed away last week. My thoughts are with the family, loved ones, HMS Queen Elizabeth crew during this very difficult time. Mr. Speaker, housing in Portsmouth is in dire straits. But local residents in Portsmouth North have valid concerns around population density, infrastructure and the environment. So I'm glad this government is working on delivering affordable housing in the city. Can the Prime Minister ensure that the infrastructure is properly considered and that communities are involved in the planning process for any new developments?
Can I start by saying I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in sending condolences to the family of Lieutenant Lyshan. I agree with her on the desperate need for affordable housing, and that's why we're going to deliver the biggest social and affording housing uplift in a generation. We will get Britain building again 1.5 million houses because the dream of home ownership was snuffed out under the last government.
We now come to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself and my party with the comments made earlier by the Prime Minister about our amazing late Queen, and also join him in sending our best wishes to Her Royal Highness Princess of Wales. I don't think anyone could have not been moved by her powerful video, and we hope that she'll make a full and speedy recovery. When it comes to fighting cancer, we know all too well that every day counts. But in the last year of the last government, there were over 100,000 patients waiting more than 2 months just to start their urgent cancer treatment, the worst on record. So will the Prime Minister help boost cancer survival rates by guaranteeing that every patient can start their cancer treatment within 62 days?
Well, I thank him for that question on a really important issue, and there's a report out by Lord Darcy tomorrow which will set out in stark terms the failure in terms of cancer treatment under the last government, which is a really serious issue. This timeline matters, which is why we're taking steps straight away to make sure that we can comply with that timeline, because lives depend on it. And that's why we've already taken a decision to put more scanners in to catch this early and use technology. It's a very serious issue, very, very serious failure by the last government.
Sir Ed Davey. Prime Minister, for that answer, and also look at the plans that the government is putting forward. Last night, Liberal Democrats voted against the withdrawing of winter fuel payments. We believe it's just wrong to balance the books by removing the support from pensioners. But we do understand that there are some difficult choices to be made to clear up the appalling financial mess left by the last Conservative government. One of the many reasons for that mess was the Conservatives prioritising tax cuts for the big banks, costing £4 billion a year.
They pay more tax.
So will the Prime Minister instead reverse those cuts so that we can afford to support millions of struggling pensioners through this very hard winter?
Well, I'll resist the temptation to get ahead of the budget. But look, what is important is that we recognise that there is this 22 billion black hole that's been left by the previous government. Now, I know that their practice was ignore it, to kick it into long grass. We're taking the tough decisions because I'm absolutely convinced that's the only way we can start rebuilding our country, investing in our public services and making sure that everybody is better off.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
12:15, and as is traditional, the conclusion of the questions from the leader of the third largest party in the House of Commons prompts us to take a step back, and we will return shortly to pick over the bones with Natasha Clark.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Budget. Number 10 think this is a message that's cutting through. They think it's going to give them the political cover to make these politically difficult decisions. He knows he's got a big majority. He's not got much time before people start getting angry about some of the decisions that he's making. He knows that when you come into government, you don't have much time if you're going to make very difficult decisions. If you're going to come and make a very tough budget, he needs to make it this one. He's saying in trying to use the political cover that I have to do it this year. I have to balance the books. But he knows that he's just not got that much time before people start going, well, you've been in power for a long time.
Well,
now.
You're the second political editor I've heard say this in the last week. I think Laura Koonsberg wrote an article about it. Was I hallucinating when Greg Clark, as chairman of the Conservative Party, spent most of the election campaign referring back to Liam Byrne's note from 2010 about there not being any money left?
Greg Hands,
Greg
the
Hands,
Conservative Party
me.
chairman. Yeah.
And Rishi Sunak raised it at PMQs after the election. No, I beg your pardon, just before the last election. So they were harking on to a global financial crisis being somehow Labour's fault 14 years after they came to power.
I fully expect that Keir Starmer is going to use this.
That Labour should stop talking about a Conservative-created financial hole 6 weeks after the election is a little unfair.
I completely agree with you. But I think that there is going to be a point where people will say, look, this is the decisions that you're making and you need to be held to account for the decisions that you're making. But yes, in terms of the economics, this is something that Keir Starmer is going to be able to make. And, I know it's really early to be thinking about the next general election into the next term, but David Cameron and George Osborne made that a really key part of their re-election campaign in 2015. It worked for them. They managed to boot out the Liberal Democrats from the coalition and managed to make a really, really successful second term for them by essentially still blaming the last government. So I imagine that this is going to be a theme that Keir Starmer is going to continue to bash again and again, because I think that he thinks that it resonates with people. After 14 years of Conservative rule, he is going to say, it's going to take me some time to sort through this and sort it all out. Let me get under the bonnet. Let me have a look at this public finances. It's way worse than we thought. And we heard him talking about that at the TUC earlier this week when he made that speech to them. For the first time, a Labour Prime Minister making that address since Gordon Brown. And he was talking about things like social care as well. He's talking about things like the NHS, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that tomorrow with Lord Darcy's report into the quite dire state of the NHS. We expect him to come back and say, and Keir Starmer is going to argue that things are so bad, it's going to take me some time to get under the bonnet and fix them.
I used the phrase, I may even have coined the phrase, front pageophobia yesterday, and it's hard to think of a government that didn't operate in fear of the newspapers, in fear of newspaper front pages. Boris Johnson reportedly, it's according to Dominic Cummings, so make of it what you will, was more concerned about how his latest behaviour would be reported in the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, his current and former employers, than he was about anything else, including his parliamentary colleagues. If Keir Starmer doesn't suffer from front pageophobia, then you, and to a lesser extent I, as journalists who cover politics, are going to be veering into relatively uncharted waters.
I think all prime ministers care about what's on the front pages of their newspapers.
It's a question of how much
they know how
care.
many papers, and how many papers are still, sold in across the UK and put in, petrol stations and WH Smiths and whatever it might be. They know that. But, I think for him...
But Starmer also, let me clarify my question. Starmer also knows, referencing Ed Davies' question a moment ago about cancer, he also knows that people at the Daily Mail are going to write headlines like, cancer deaths set to soar 17% over the next 5 years under Labour, Charity warned. So Charity is warning that the consequences of the last government mean that cancer deaths are likely to soar in the next 5 years.
Between
and
a
the
rock and a
Daily
hard
Mail
place
turn
here,
it
isn't
into a
he?
Labour headline. So because he is a Labour leader, and almost all of Fleet Street is dedicated to supporting the Tory movement, some of it, of course, now Farage, Starmer isn't going to govern with the lips of Paul Dacre or whatever his modern equivalent.
Definitely not in the same way. Definitely not in the same way.
Really
it's going to be
interesting.
different. It's going to be different. And obviously, you've seen a slew of front pages today talking about prisons. And
which he knew would happen.
He knew would happen, and he decided to make that decision anyway, knowing that that's going to be on the front page of every
Starmer bottled it. Not Sunak bottled it, even when he was told to do it.
This was a decision that Rishi Sunak didn't take
because of
and
these
didn't
front
want
pages.
to take. I don't think
before
this is the entire reason.
Election.
Yeah, I don't think he. I think actually doing such a thing during an election campaign would have been fraught with risk from whichever side you come at it from. But yes, Starmer's decided to take this decision. It's very clear that he's willing to be unpopular. He has the political mandate to be able to do so. He has the numbers in the House of Commons. It doesn't matter that 52 Labour MPs abstained yesterday on the winter fuel payment. Obviously, like I say, things are going to get worse for him. But it's a risk that he can afford to take because of the power that he's got, because of the numbers in the House of Commons that he's got, and because we are just a few months out from that election. Now is the time he has to strike while the iron's hot, or he's not going to get anything done for the next 5 years.
And very nicely put. And then the stuff about farming.
I think Rishi Sunak has showed us that he is now very much on the route back to the backbenches, isn't he? This is something that it's British Farming Day today, which is why all the MPs in the House of Commons are wearing this sort of wheat tucked into many of their lapels. And these kind of this is usually something that a backbencher would stand up and say, is the Prime Minister going to look at the NFU's idea to enshrine a target for food security in our laws? That is something you do not expect to come from the leader of the opposition's mouth. Let's not forget Rishi Sunak has a very rural constituency up in Richmond, and I imagine he might be trying to use the last PMQs that he has available to him in his slot to maybe raise some of the issues that some of his constituents might want him to. A cynic might say that.
Well, and of course it also begs the question of why the prisons story wasn't raised by Rishi Sunak, possibly, as we suggested beforehand, because he'd be hit immediately over the head with the Mark Rowley letter that he completely ignored.
I think, potentially he thought that wasn't a great line to go down on. But like I say, he's spoken about prisons before. He's spoken about overcrowding before. He's spoken about the fact that the Labour Party want to let people out of prison early, and it's not been something that he's been afraid to go on. But maybe in the cold light of day, that letter, some of the attacks that we've seen from the previous on the previous government in the last few days, maybe decided to make him change his mind.
I know I'm labouring the point, but it's my particular obsession. That's also evidence of what I'm trying but failing to articulate in terms of the change in the nature of political reporting, in that a newspaper can pretend that this is all Keir Starmer's fault, as the Daily Mail has done today, but actually Rishi Sunak can't, because the facts will be presented in the House of Commons in a way that they won't be presented in the right-wing newspapers. So that's why he hasn't. Because normally you've got a front page attacking a Prime Minister, then the leader of the opposition would be all over it in PMQs. But of course it's a bogus attack, so you can't.
Yeah, and potentially...
Although Johnson would have done.
Potentially, yeah. But, there were a few things... I said sort of last week, I thought that this, winter fuel was going to be one of the four things I think Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives will continue to bash Labour over the head with in the next sort of 4 weeks, alongside unions. That was another potential topic that he could have gone on. Unions, pay rises, the TUC conference. Farming definitely didn't come up on my list, so I'll hold my hands up there and say...
On this occasion, you can be forgiven for that. That doesn't count as a miss.
Yeah, I don't think that will count.
A swing and a miss.
But yes, look, I think that Rishi Sunak is on his way out. He's on his way back to the backbenches, and he's thinking about his constituents and thinking, you know what, why not? Two questions on farming.
Do you think he'll stay on the backbenches for the next 4 years?
Hard to say if he gets a better offer.
Yeah.
People will say and point to his sense of duty as a Prime Minister, the fact that he is still technically acting leader of the Conservative Party, while all of his successors scrap like rats in a sack about who they want to replace him. he is still standing up day in, day out at Prime Minister's questions, attempting to try and land a few blows on the Prime Minister. One might argue from this session, not trying hugely hard, but is still there. And people close to him will say, look, he's got a sense of duty. He will do the right thing for the party. He'll do the right thing for his constituents. But, we know from previous that many former Prime Ministers do not tend to stick around that well, whether it's Liz Truss, booted out by the electorate, whether it's David Cameron, who decides that he actually wants to go and do something very different. George Osborne as well.
Indeed. Something I've noticed, and it may, I know I sometimes seem to be shamelessly promoting my book, but this is pertinent to the title of my book. He's using the phrase broken a lot. Mm-hmm. In that one PMQs, the prison system was broken by the previous government. The NHS was broken by the previous government. That probably will overtake the £22 billion rhetorically. When it comes to having to justify the difficult decisions he keeps talking about. Yep. The notion that the last lot broke everything becomes very pertinent and potentially quite effective.
It does, and fix the foundations. That's Keir Starmer's new slogan as well, slapped on the front of a podium outside Number 10 just a couple of weeks ago when he made that gloomy Rose Garden speech. The problem with obviously talking about the country being broken is that you've then got to fix it, mate. You've then got this really unenviable task of coming in and saying, once we have got under the bonnet, we have the solutions to try and do that. And people I don't think are going to want to wait too long before they start looking and going, okay, you have said how terrible it is, but we voted for change. You promised us change. That was the buzzword of his in the election, wasn't it? Day in, day out, he was shouting change, and people with posters at every single rally. So he's got to at some point come forward with some of the potential solutions to fix these problems, and I don't think he has too long before people start crying out for those solutions to fix what he calls broken Britain.
I want to see improvements everywhere from prisons to hospitals.
And give people a little bit of hope as well. At the moment, the government talking about the upcoming budget are not doing, I think, a good enough job to talk about the potential for growth and the potential to grow the economy. And, we're expecting this workers' rights package at some point to come up again. But I think the government and the Treasury and the Business Department can do more to talk about what Labour did talk about quite a lot in the election campaign. The number one mission, Keir Starmer's government, grow the economy, get people back on track. I don't think he's been talking enough about this. I don't think they've been making the case for positivity, for hope, and to give people something a little bit to look forward to. But it's all part of this narrative that Keir Starmer's trying to weave about the previous government.
When you say this is his last PMQs, do you mean his last ever?
Will that be Rishi Sunak's last PMQs ever?
Do we not come back from conference with a new leader or not?
No, there is I think there is, so that it will be come down to from 4 to 2 after a party conference. I forget which date exactly it is, but the MPs will whittle it down one further time to 2. So I think there may be one further Prime Minister's questions, I think, for Rishi Sunak beforehand. And then, like I say, we will get a new leader. I think it's not till November we get a new leader. So if my maths is right, there should be a couple in October after conference.
So Mel Stride was defenestrated yesterday.
The Melmentum was not with him.
Who is likely to benefit from his votes?
Obviously, he's slightly more on the left of the Conservative Party in terms of that spectrum. So I imagine those votes are going to go to Cleverly and probably a little bit to Tugendhat as well.
Cleverly is still perceived, well, I suppose being to the left of Kemi Badenoch is almost impossible not to be, but he is still perceived, and Jenrick is, as someone said recently, I think he'd do anything. He'd sacrifice a kitten in Westminster Hall if he thought there was a percentage point in it.
I couldn't disagree with that.
Not big on substance or integrity, but so Cleverly is still perceived as being towards the centre.
Yeah, I think so. I think Cleverly is probably the most centrist of those candidates. There was
so a Cleverly Jenrick face-off at the end?
Kemi's probably not going to be doing. I think she'll be disappointed by the results yesterday. Not putting on a few votes, but not as many as potentially she needed to retain.
Right.
Jenrick's still out in front. So yes, it really does depend on it exactly how they do.
And then Tugendhat, you'd think his votes would go in a similar direction to Stride's when he gets.
Well, it benefits people like Cleverly, right? Because if you think Tom Tugendhat's going to get knocked out, and you think he will get all of those votes, and unlikely some of them going to Pretty and to Jenrick, then it's all about that maths of where those go next. But we're going into this conference season beauty parade where the four of them will face off against each other, and I think we know that the Tory members themselves are more likely to back a right of centre candidate. So people like Robert Jenrick, people like Kemi Badenoch, they are going to be the people that they want to see in that final. I think MPs will probably be more keen to see someone like Cleverly or Tugendhat get into that final, to at least give the members a little bit more of a chance. There's always the chance that we could end up with a Jenrick Kemi final. It could happen. It depends on the numbers of the MPs and which way they go.
Watch this space. Great stuff. Thank you, Natasha. Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, providing acute analysis of a whole variety of political hot potatoes. We'll probably return to some of them after 1:45 today, when we're joined by, I think must be the longest serving political editor in the country, Andy Bell of Channel 5 News.
Definitely up there.
He must
and one of the
Who
best
else would
as well.
be? He is, isn't he? He's a legend. You'll find out why at 12:45. First, though, and Ed Daffan is with me after the news. You'll know Ed. He was the one of the people responsible for the blog, the Grenfell Action Group blog, that catalogued, almost an inadequate word, concerns, I would say, who predicted the Grenfell Tower tragedy and was roundly and contemptuously ignored by the people who could have prevented it. So some of his first responses to Sir Martin Morbick's report coming up after the headlines with Amelia Cox.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So a sort of recurring feature on Wednesdays when PMQs actually happens, rather than try and get an entirely box fresh phone-in off the ground, we try to catch up with people who have been involved in recent events and may have interesting things to tell us about them. That's rarely truer than today. I'm joined by Ed Daffan, who was the one of the founders of the Grenfell Action blog, which described retrospectively speaking, in grisly detail, the problems that were likely to contribute to the sort of tragedy that we witness. But he joins me today for the first time since Sir Martin Morbick reported, and I'm very grateful to you for your time, Edward. I mean, you can't have been taken by surprise by anything that was in Sir Martin's report, but I suspect you may have been relieved by it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the report itself was almost characterised by its lack of surprise. I mean, there was no Hercule Poirot moment where the murderer was revealed. And in fact, rather predictably, we found that, all the suspects were wielding the knives. And when I say that, I'm talking about government, their failure to regulate, their policy of deregulation over many different parties, but in particular around Cameron in 2014, putting UK PLC above the health and safety of people, and their failure to take notice of previous disasters, previous fires. They had a series of 999 calls that they should have responded to, and they failed to. And then, of course, the report went on to name Arconic, the cladding manufacturers, Kingspan and Celotex, who made the installation, and found that, they were companies that, again, simply put profit before people. And then the report goes further into our landlord, the tenant management organisation, how they bullied and marginalised residents.
Especially you.
Especially me, yeah. Anyone that put their head above the parapet was fair game for them.
I hesitate to use the word vindication because, of course, we're discussing a tragedy that left so many people dead. But is it a word that popped into your mind on that day last week?
Look, I think what the report says about the TMO, who I had always described as little better than a mini mafia, a non-functioning organisation, was searingly vindicated. I think the report went further, though. I mean, it showed that they were concealing fire, health and safety concerns from their board, and in turn preventing them from being revealed to the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the London Fire Brigade, and anyone else. And that was primarily at the hands of Robert Black, the chief executive
of the TMO. Did it? I think it did, but I just want to get it on the record, as it were. Did it meet any fears of cover-up or sweeping under the carpet? There was some criticism. Indeed, David Lammy was one of the people who criticised the appointment of Sir Martin Morbick. But the breadth and the depth of the final report, I think, scotched any fears of cover-up or sweeping under the carpet. Of course, what you think is much more important.
So my own personal view is that all the evidence was so explicit, was so damning. I couldn't see any other conclusion of the report except for what it was, and in that way, as I've explained, there were no surprises. I do think there were a couple of things that were omitted from the report. I think the fact that it didn't look at kind of race and class was a major omission, and within the recommendations, I feel that we had the social housing regulation bill that was always going to kind of deal with social housing policy as a kind of separate entity to the report. But the report threw up so many concerns around lack of resident engagement, the way that people in social housing are treated, the culture of kind of them, the people that run social housing, and us, the people that live in it, that I think that Sir Martin should have gone further and made some recommendations around empowering residents, basically. I mean, it's a power balance that was a problem. It was a power balance that ensured that we didn't get heard as residents.
And I did something Angela Rayner addressed actually the day after the report came out on this programme. So we shall watch with interest to see whether she rises to the challenge or they rise to the challenges that you describe. But what's interesting, Ed, is that every time we do we have a conversation about it, however I frame the question or wherever I'm trying to sit the conversation, race and class. Race and class. We had the phrase loser housing popped up last week as the attitude from TMOs towards people still in social housing after decades of right to buy and the rest of it. And you're right. It's a notable omission from the report, I think. What happens next? Where do you or we go from here?
So, I mean, the report's 1,700 pages long. I think there are 58 recommendations. There's a lot to digest, but there are some very obvious matters that are put in front of us straight away. So, 6 months for the government to respond to the recommendations made in the report feels like a long time. I hope that we can make some progress on that. They're talking about the autumn until they make a statement about cladding, and that feels like a long time, considering there are 4,600 buildings in the country with dangerous cladding on, of which only a third have been remediated. And then we've got the issue of the Met Police. And for many people, Grenfell is around three things. It's around the truth, and we have had a strong element of the truth in the public inquiry report. Yeah. It's around justice. It's around the clink of handcuffs, of which there hasn't been a single one.
No.
And
do you think there will be?
So the history of Hillsborough, Zeebrugge, is not encouraging. Whether it's the kind of corporate manslaughter by gross negligence, I'm not sure. Possibly corporate manslaughter. But I think around fraud, around fire safety order, around malpractice in public office, just from seeing the evidence at the public inquiry, I'm reasonably confident that there will be successful prosecutions there.
The Met statement seemed to add to that perception, didn't it? Albeit that the amount of time it's going to take for the wheels of justice to turn is not good news. I mean, it feels perhaps a little excessive. And that brings us back to the companies, which is, of course, in many ways where it all began. Arconic, which was found to have senior executives who knew that the cladding could be highly flammable. They knew it didn't meet safety standards, and instead of distributing warnings or withdrawing it from market, they were, and I quote, determined to exploit what it saw as weak regulatory regimes in certain countries, including the UK. Kingspan, which made about 5% of the foam insulation used at Grenfell, knowingly made false claims about its ability to withstand fire. Sir Martin and his colleagues found that the company had long-running internal discussions about what it could get away with. When questions were raised about safety, a senior manager just said that critics could, I can't say that word on the radio, can I? They could go bleep themselves. And finally, Celotex, which made pretty much the rest or most of the insulation, was found to have tried to break the market by, quotes, dishonest means after it found it could not meet regulations with its own rival to Kingspan's product. And it presented its insulation as safe even though it knew it was not the case. We'll get on in a moment. I'm going to take a while before the break. to what you think, or how you think we, ordinary people, could possibly address these companies. But I want to tell you what a caller said on the morning immediately afterwards. And as I always do when I talk about Grenfell, I referenced the work that you and Francis did on your blog and talked about it at length. And one of my earliest callers said to me about you, Edward, what if he hadn't written it down? What if that document hadn't been there? So what if the comparison between what you knew to be the case and what happened had not been available? How all modesty aside, for want of a better word, how crucial do you think that catalogue was?
So, I mean, looking at it now after the public inquiry, which was such a forensic exercise, I think they probably would have got there anyway.
If we'd got to the public
inquiry. If we got to the public inquiry.
Yeah.
But I think that, I mean, our aim was always, we never ever believed that the blog would change things for us as residents, but we were sure as hell not going to be treated without responding. And so the blog was a historical record of how a community in social housing were treated in the 21st century in the 5th or 6th richest country in the world. And we wanted to document that. And it was very forensic. It was based a lot on freedom of information requests. We knew how badly we were being treated. We knew how non-functioning our landlord was, and you know, there was no prophecy there. It was just a solid prediction of what would happen when you have a landlord that was incompetent and didn't have its eye on health and safety, and you know, in the most tragic fashion. The fire happened, and one use of it was, you know, when I was being interviewed by the Met Police in part of their murder inquiry, they were very grateful for the amount of information that we had on the blog. So, if for nothing else, it served that purpose.
And finally, the companies, they're all still in business, I think, aren't they?
They're all still in business. They're all absolutely denying that they had anything to do with Grenfell, despite the fact.
So's David Cameron, of course.
So's David Cameron.
What did you think of that comment?
I thought it was absolutely disgusting, really. People have to take, no one came to the public inquiry taking responsibility for what they did. It was a game of a carousel of buck passing. For them to then carry on the carousel of buck passing when the report has come out is just beyond belief. I'm angry, but I'm not surprised, because that's kind of the nature of how it's been for us.
Can we do anything? I mean, with regard to these companies, is there any plans afoot or any ideas?
So look, I mean, generally, we just need to ensure that the recommendations are enacted by this government. We need longer term. We need a national oversight mechanism. We need this government to implement an independent body that will monitor and follow up on recommendations made by public inquiries. But on a much lesser level, I mean, if you're a homeowner and you're thinking of insulating your loft, don't use Kingspan and don't use Celotex, and tell your friends, if you're insulating your loft, don't use these companies, because you gave a very cogent explanation of what they'd been up to. There's only one way to really hurt these companies, and that's financially, because they show no remorse, they show no contrition. So let's go out and let's make sure that we don't buy their products anymore.
Edward Daffan, thank you.
Thank you.
It is 12:48. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:01 is the time, and I will pass on your messages of, I don't know quite what the word is. Bapinda just says, well done, Ed. And I will pass on those messages. Congratulations wouldn't be the right word, would it? In the same way that vindication wasn't quite the right word either. I asked Natasha Clark earlier whether Andy Bell, the political editor of Channel 5 News, would be the longest-serving political editor in the lobby, and we can't think of anyone else. I'll tell you how long he's been political editor of Channel 5 News. He was political editor of Channel 5 News when I worked for Channel 5. So we are going back a while.
We're going back a few years. I'd say there may be someone hiding in Parliament somewhere who goes back further than me, but I haven't found him yet.
One of those obscure cupboards that have probably got a plaque that Tony Benn put there 50 years ago or something like that. Andy is here because he has written a book which, when you hear what it addresses, you may immediately understand my interest. It's a thriller about Brexit.
Yeah, the aftermath, really. Well, the aftermath of the vote, but it's a thriller about that sort of crazy, mad period when the referendum had happened. It starts with the referendum. We should say it's a fictional book for a start. It's a novel. It starts with the referendum, ends in the 2019 election, and it just goes through that period where for me, it was like the country got about as close to having a sort of political nervous breakdown as we've had in recent years, because if you remember, everything was locked up. Parliament couldn't agree how to make the next move for, the best part of 3 years. You couldn't even have an election because of the rules that had been brought in with the coalition. Yeah. And everything got stuck, and everyone got crosser and crosser. And I'm, as you say, political editor with 5, so I covered all that and thought, there's a story in here, and that's what I've done.
So why did you want to tell a story through a fictional lens rather than, for example, put together a non-fiction account of all the sort of wriggles and turns?
Well, for a start, there's some pretty good non-fictional versions out there, but True. I'm not here to plug anyone else's book. Go on. But I suppose I always wanted to write a novel, and I just started writing this one around about probably 2017 when this was all going on. And I came up with the idea of these 4 different characters. One's a Labour MP, one's a TV news producer, one's a government spad, and one is a kind of Brexit UKIP activist. And initially I had more an idea of the characters and a sort of start and an end point rather than a sort of plot to carry it through. And then I worked the plot through, and these 4, their lives intersect. They do some good things, they do quite a lot of bad things, and then the idea is it builds up to, this isn't a spoiler because there's a prologue which sets it out, you're building up to an event where it's clear at least one of them is in some real danger. It's based around the final event being a sort of live TV debate during the 2019 election.
Did you enjoy the freedom of fiction, and given that it is fictional, will people come away with it with a better knowledge of stuff that did actually happen?
I mean, I'm not going to pretend that every dot and comma is absolutely correct in terms of the timings, in terms of what happened in terms of the delay between one event and another. Sometimes I have telescoped events a little bit, if I can put it like that. Yeah. But I would hope it gives an idea, especially of the kind of sense of the time where people got angrier and angrier, and people got into their sort of silos, and friendships were broken, and inside and also outside Parliament kind of temperatures rose. And actually, in terms of what's happened recently after the terrible events in Southport and the riots we had following that, in my book there are elements of people that frankly I saw on the streets on some demonstrations that were being brought out by the kind of tensions that were growing after that vote. And I think some of the tensions that were playing out then, we sort of seen in the last few weeks again.
Seeds were definitely sown, weren't they? Which I suppose we should ask whether real people come in and out of the action.
Yeah, there are real people in terms of Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, but they're always kind of one step removed, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, of course.
So my characters are doing other jobs where they come in. To give you one example, the day that Boris Johnson comes out onto Downing Street to say, the doomsters and the gloomsters are going to have their comeuppance, one of my characters is TV News is on the other side of the road from number 10. One is a SPAD watching from where all the SPADs and the staff watch in Downing Street, when their sort of principal is on the doorstep. My UKIP activist is outside on a demo. So that's the sort of way I tried to bring my characters into the real events and have real characters as the sort of focal point around which my characters were acting.
So, of course, the behind-the-scenes stuff is going to be an eyewitness account, albeit that you fictionalise some of the events. People who want to know what goes on when the cameras are off, or what goes on just off camera, or what goes on behind the scenes, it would work as a textbook for them. Michael's already impressed, Andy. He says, I'm going to buy this today.
Really?
Well, I haven't even said the title yet, Michael. Give me a chance. It's called Sovereign Territory by Andy Bell. What was it like reporting on that period? I suspect this book might have been a form of therapy for you, because it was such a weird, and I did some reporting on it as well, and there were days when you honestly had to remind yourself what reality actually was, because there were very senior figures in both politics and media describing something completely different on a daily basis.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary period. I mean, on one level, it was an extraordinary news period. Normally when you
great for business.
Well, I mean, I have to say, on most days you have a conversation with your news editors in the morning and you say, where are we going to be at the end of the day? And a lot of those days in that period, you were saying, I have no idea where we're going to be at the end of the day. There's going to be a vote. It's probably going to go down. We don't know by how much. We don't know if the Prime Minister is still going to be in position at the end of the day. Reporting on it was quite... How can I put it? Yeah, I mean, when you say was it a form of therapy? I guess in some ways it kind of was, because also we were all drawn into it as journalists. So people are probably familiar with the scene outside Parliament, or what we call Abingdon Green or College Green, which basically became this kind of like a great big kind of festival of news outlets with towers and gazebos and all the rest of it. And around the edge, often there were some very unhappy and upset people. So you sort of ran the gauntlet a wee bit as well when you were going out to your broadcasters. Certainly MPs did. And one of the themes, which unfortunately is still with us, that the book picks up on, is the kind of pressure, the kind of real threats that MPs have to endure. And unfortunately, especially female MPs, it's still a fact.
I suppose history of sorts was made during Keir Starmer's first address to the press as Prime Minister, when he congratulated you on your daughter's performance in the Olympics. That came out of the left field, didn't it?
It did a bit, yes. Georgia Bell, who won a bronze medal in the 50. She's a big fan of the book.
Sheila, is that what proud dads look like, or is that what proud dads look like?
He and I have already talked about this. We've already talked about this. But never mind Keir Starmer. What about Mick Jagger?
Oh yes, well, that was true. Yes, Jimmy Fallon, who was there with Mick Jagger, and I don't know if people may have seen a little bit on social media, where Jimmy Fallon does an impression of Mick Jagger cheering my daughter at the racing and at the 1500 metres. I just want to say again, Georgia Bell, big fan of this book, Sovereign Territory.
What a shame that she didn't win her medal in time to stick her name on the cover.
Exactly. I wanted her to carry it around with her, but for some reason.
On the podium. That would have been, there's all sorts of rules and laws being broken. Have you got another one in you? It's always interesting.
I've certainly got some thoughts. I certainly would like to, and some of the, I'm not sure all the characters, no spoilers, we're going to make it through to the next one, but it would be quite nice to sort of see if we could take it on another step.
Lovely stuff. Andy Bell, whose novel Sovereign Territory is out now in paperback. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Known forevermore as Georgia's dad.
Send Mick Jagger a copy.
Yeah, there you go. Send Mick Jagger a copy.
And Jimmy Fallon.
Can you do my marketing as well, please?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
That's it for today. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4 on LBC, but now, as you may have gathered, it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Always talking before she's supposed to.
James O'Brien on LBC.